Hello everyone, this is another writing example little thing I'm doing for my channel. Again, a little more freeform than most of my videos, so I hope you don't mind the filler words and me going off a little bit on random things. But yeah, it is a little storming where I'm at, so power's kind of in and out, so you may hear some weird noises in the background, but I'll do my best to keep this consistent. But today, I thought what would be a fun subject to talk about is some real life examples you can use as inspiration for horror and other similar writing. Now, the real world is a strange and often terrifying place. If you actually dig into the world around you, you'll find many strange or even scary things that may come in handy for you to either understand the world better or even as a source of inspiration for your writing. So, some fun examples of this mental health, which is always a fun topic. Many mental illnesses, neurodivergences, and many things like that actually come in many different forms than people realize. People can be stressed into a mental break. People can carry it their entire lives, some not even knowing it. And others can adapt to it or even have it adapt to them, which is always fascinating. Which is definitely a fun subject, and one I wish to explore in the future, but unfortunately, mental health is a little too complicated for me to go over in a 2 hour, 3 hour video. So, we're going to do something a lot simpler. We're going to talk about cults, specifically cults and authoritative mind control, also things known as the BITE model or the BITE authoritative mind control model. Again, I know it's a weird thing to bring up, but it is a helpful way of actually understanding how these kinds of things work and can be helpful for you when making fiction. So if you're going to make a fictional cult, it helps to understand how real cults actually work. Again, I know it's an odd thing, but I do have a point to all this. So let's start by explaining the BITE model, and then we'll go from there. Please note, while the BITE model is a real thing and is based on real cult-like behavior, I'm using it for fictitious stories, so keep that in mind. This is not really intended to be something for you to identify if you are or are not in a cult. However, if you find yourself in a place where you are questioning where you are at as going over this model, it may be good to critically think about where you are before taking any further action. Do I know the point I am trying to make here? Yes. Is it coming across clearly? I hope so. But essentially, this is just meant to be a way of helping guide you and get started in fiction, even if it is based on a real life model. So, with that understood, let's begin. So, what is a cult? A cult is, in general, a small group devoted to a person, idea, or philosophy, usually religious, although it could also be non-religious. Sorry if I sound a little different, I just realized my headset wasn't plugged in. It can also be a system of religious beliefs, usually not recognized as an established religion. It can also be an organized group that dominates members through psychological manipulation and pressure strategies. Again, all these distinctions are important because you may see the term cult interchanged with religion. You may also see the term cult interchanged with belief systems. And again, you may even see cult to just mean something like a cult classic, like Killer Clowns from Outer Space. And something like that, it is something that is well loved among a small group of people. But you may notice that a small group of people with a belief system is not necessarily immediately a bad thing. That being said, when we're going to be talking about cults in this video, we're going to be talking about those that manipulate through psychological pressure and other means to establish control over the group. So, yes, cults are definitely a very real thing. You could probably look up quite a few online. I'm not going to list them all here. But again, and with the imagery of cults in fiction, you usually imagine a bunch of men in black robes that chant and perform virgin sacrifices, which, fun little fact, usually that virgin sacrifice doesn't actually mean someone who hasn't had sex. It means someone who's not used their blood or other means for magical or religious means. It's usually why they had to target someone outside the group for that. Usually, if you're in a cult, you're already sacrificed some part of yourself to it. Thing is, most modern cults, especially in fiction, don't look like that. Although if you want to do a story about a bunch of black men in robes chanting, by all means do that. But this thing will definitely be useful here. And please also note that real world cults is a history that is quite interesting and could definitely be studied. It's not something that I'm going to discuss here. Now, the bite model is a useful little means of telling if something is or isn't possessing a cult behavior. Now, the bite model, developed by Stephen Hassan, a cult survivor, it stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotion. It's a model for dictating how authoritarian a thought control is going to be. By this model, it's unique compared to other models that it is both applicable in a wide set and in a very short set. It's even applicable within groups as small as two, or abusive relationships, which apparently the creator of the model, Stephen Hassan, believed that abusive relationships were a cult of one. It's also applicable because the model can also go as wide as entire governments, the entire world, or interworld governments, which is extremely helpful if you're doing this kind of fiction. It can definitely be helpful for engaging in how authoritarian of a society, club, or group you are in. These examples that are used can exist in a story and can be a good starting place for any aspiring writers, especially if you're trying to create a group in a fiction that can either be a shade of gray or could actually be something legitimately dangerous. And again, there are lots of shades of gray. Lots of groups you will find will possess some form of the bite model, but that does not necessarily make them a cult. A lot of this comes down to patterns, how often the action occurs, and severity, how severe the actual action is. This can be incredibly helpful, because again, if something possesses one or two of these things does not necessarily make it a cult. If something possesses a lot of these things, or the few things it does possess is pretty extreme, you may need to rethink where you are or what kind of model you're doing it. So again, do also note that this model, as wide as it doesn't cover every possible variation, but it does cover a lot. It can help people critically analyze where they are, and it has an advantage of it isn't black and white of cult and not a cult, but a near infinite shades of gray that can cover anything from a manipulative teenager to a multiversal dictator. Again, we're using this real-life model as a guide for writing. It is extremely effective for that, but it does not mean that something just doesn't follow the group model is not harmful, even if it displays none of the following actions. Please also note that it's also just generally helpful if you're going to build an authoritative cult or dystopia in your fiction, that you're aware of what real-life groups do. It allows people to analyze what's going on there and be able to go, oh, that's some place I'm actually familiar with or someplace I don't want to go. So let's examine the bite model a little closer. Let's examine behavior. So behavior is the way that someone acts, and this is control over how they act before you can control anything else. Again, these things don't necessarily have to flow in this order, but you'll find that controlling the way someone acts is generally the best way to start. Again, this is a normal part of human socialization. Whether that's good or not, I'm not going to talk about right here. Because again, human socialization does require some degree of behavioral control. But again, it comes down to pattern versus the severity. If you're trying to avoid someone urinating in public, that's one level of behavioral control versus avoiding someone urinating at all. But behavioral control often will come with the feeling of trying to regulate someone's reality. So let's say, for example, I'm going to use a fictional example. Someone's constantly seeing ghosts everywhere, but you want to keep them from saying that they're seeing the ghosts. So you might start with telling them the ghosts aren't actually there, the ghosts aren't real, or to act like the ghosts aren't there. And then gradually, as you get them to start behaving like the ghosts they see aren't there, it'll be easier to get them to behave as if the ghosts aren't there. And then as time goes on, it gets easier and easier for that person to believe that the things they're seeing aren't actually there. Again, kind of comes down to severity of the action. Now, another form of behavioral control you'll find are a lot of rules, usually random or arbitrary, often without explanation or reason. Again, just because something has rules doesn't automatically make it a cult, because again, rules is a pretty basic social contract, pretty basic social function for humanity and other social species. Again, you don't walk up to someone on the street and strike them in the face. They don't walk up the street and strike you too. It's a pretty basic social contract. But again, you'll notice with that, there's a reason. You don't randomly attack people. They don't randomly attack you. When you're trying to deal with something of behavioral control, on the other hand, you'll find rules that will not have an explanation or reason. You find this a lot, for example, in rules pastas. You will find people that will actually have certain rules, and you will find that they follow these rules, oftentimes with just kind of a vague sense that something bad might happen. But there's no explanation about why the rules are there or the reason why the rule works. Again, there are exceptions. There's some creepypastas that do explain this. But overall, the sense of there is just you have the rules, you have to follow them. Funny thing, I'm old enough to remember one of the very first rules pastas where someone actually had to figure out the rules because their house would keep essentially lashing out at them whenever they broke a rule. So they had to figure out what the rule was and then write it down. It's an interesting thought process, but something I think is worth considering. So it's going to so whatever is trying to control you in an authoritative manner will create rules for you to follow and will do so without explanation or reason. And depending on severity, these rules may be set in stone. The rule is established and then not changed. Or the rules may actually increase in severity and sensitivity. Using an example, let's say the rules say you can't eat after midnight. Okay, pretty straightforward. You can't eat after midnight. But then it defines the rules as you can't eat after midnight or before noon. Okay, still something you can work with. You have to get used to it, but you can do that. Well, now the rules are saying you can't eat after midnight and you can't eat between the hours of 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. Okay, that leaves you a 9-hour window where you can't do that. And then you may actually find that this escalates further and further. And again, even if it doesn't escalate, does not necessarily mean it isn't a form of control. But that does get to lead me to the next part. You will also find rules that will dictate control over clothing or hairstyle. Again, you will find that this is common, especially on a societal scale, with the expectation of you dress a certain way to behave in a certain sect, or you have a certain hairstyle to mean a certain thing. And again, depending on how severe this can be anything from a broad okay, you have long hair, you're more likely to be identified as feminine, to something far more extreme, such as your hairstyle dictates you are not upper society, so you are not allowed to be in this place. Again, those are real life examples. You may do in fiction however you wish. You may also find rules that dictate where someone is allowed to live and who they interact with. Again, you see this a lot in a societal scale, which is where your place in society often dictates where you live and who you are allowed to interact with. Again, depending on your government, depending on where you live, this can be anything from you just interact with your neighbors because they're the closest people with you, to you can only interact with these people and there are people you are not allowed to talk to. There are caste systems that have that. There are feudalistic systems that have this. Again, it's a form of behavioral control and will relate to other parts of the model we will be going over much later. You will also find behavioral control that will regulate over your food, diet, fasting, calorie counting. You see this a lot in diet culture, and that is a real life thing I actually do want to talk about a little bit. You see it quite a bit where people will talk about the kinds of foods and they will deprive you of, or that you should deprive yourself of, certain nutrients you are not allowed to use, things like that. Again, it can get fuzzy because the science of diet and exercise and all that, there is some validity to it, Exercise overall can help you feel better if you generally control what you eat, where you make sure you get good diverse food, you can get plenty of nutrients, or you just, eat food you enjoy, you're doing pretty good. But again, some diet culture where you will have you calorie counting to extremes. Some of them may get you to fast. Okay, sometimes it's something relatively minor where you don't eat during the day, and then there are more extreme things that will actually get you to fast for entire days or even weeks, which again, not something fun. I know that there was once a real life cult that actually convinced people to just not eat at all, convincing them they could deprive nutrients from the sun. Yeah, that cult did not last very long. But yeah, you will find a lot of food control happens in cult-like behavior. Again, matters on severity and it matters on what's going on. Because again, your parents saying no, you can't eat this food because you're allergic to it, not really a form of, well, I guess it is a form of behavioral control, but it is something that has an explanation and a reason behind it. Other people, a lot of religious practices also have some form of regulation over food, and again, even then, there's usually exceptions. From what I understand about Ramadan fasting, is if you are not able to go all day without eating, you're allowed to eat during the day. And similar thing about eating kosher in Judaism. If you can't eat kosher for whatever reason, you're allowed to not eat kosher. And again, depends on severity. If there are sects that don't allow those kinds of things, that's definitely a form of more advanced behavioral control. But again, d- control over food and diet is a form of behavioral control and can help shape behavior. I'm not sure if you've ever seen some people go hungry, but they can become quite angry when when they're hungry, and you can get people to do some really crazy things when they're hungry. Another form of control, which will often affect behavior and how well people feel, manipulation of sleep, usually depriving sleep or controlling what hours people are allowed to sleep. Again, some of these are pretty broad and societal, such as the expectation of sleeping at night, expectation of sleeping for 8 hours. Some are a little more direct, such as requiring people to stay up for days on end, or an expectation to study overnight and have this be a regular occurrence. And again, sleep is a human need. People need sleep. Yes, some people need more sleep than others, but at the same time, we don't necessarily measure everyone's need to sleep at the same level. Essentially, just because some people can require less sleep doesn't mean that we require all people to sleep only the same amount as them. That all being said, manipulation of sleep can definitely affect people. You don't sleep long enough, you will start to hallucinate, and it will be a lot easier to manipulate you. You may form false memories or even start doing things that you may not fully remember. So, with that in mind, be sure you get plenty of sleep. And if a group is trying to affect how much you're allowed to sleep, usually by depriving you of sleep, that's definitely something worth evaluating and you may want to get out of that situation. Now, this one is also one that you see a lot in the real world. It's financial control. There's both direct and indirect. Some are pretty straightforward. I control the money. Everything we spend, you do with my permission. Or something more subtle, such as if you'd love me, you'd give me this money. And again, depends on severity and depends on scale, but you'll find that control of money or similar finances is a form of behavioral control practiced by nearly every group of nearly every scale. Again, depends on severity. For example, a government asking taxes is usually not a too extreme form of behavioral control. I say usually, I'm sure there's lots of different examples that we can look up, and I'm sure you can tell me all about them in the comments. I'm not going to be digging too deeply into taxes for that. And then there are less subtle means of financial control. Some fun examples includes, well, I need to watch over your finances because we need to make sure you're not spending your money on frivolous things. And again, that's where things get interesting because if it's your money, why can't you spend it on frivolous things? And again, it all depends on severity. a book club asking to collect $5 a month to help pay for wine costs every time they meet is not really a form of behavioral control compared to, say, a a church that demands 95% of your income because they need it to pay for the pastor's newest Lamborghini. I don't know cars, sue me. But again, financial control can be direct or indirect. In rules pastas a lot, the rules don't directly deal with money directly, but nearly every single story starts with the same thing. I am struggling with money. I need a job that pays. This job is paying me enough to stay, and it's paying you enough to deal with all kinds of things that are occurring, which is again a form of behavioral control. But again, it's easy to think financial control. Okay, you're taking my money, you're taking what I want. Another form of financial control is them paying you to do things you would not normally be comfortable with. So if I ask you to stand 8 hours a day and push a button 3 times an hour, you probably wouldn't want to do that too much. If on the other hand I offered to pay you $100 an hour, 8 hours a day to push a button 3 times an hour, you're a lot more likely to actually want to do that. Now imagine that instead of me asking you to push a button, I was asking you to hurt someone. Or imagine I was asking you to perform a chant. Or imagine I was asking you to steal something. Again, financial control is a form of behavioral control. And when people don't have a lot of money, it generally gets a lot easier to bribe them with money. You can get people to do things they wouldn't normally do because you're offering them money. And whether the money or payment is real or fake, that is a form of behavioral control through finance. And you will find that like people who have less money are usually more vulnerable to this. That being said, even people from a rich financial background can be vulnerable to this. A fun example people rarely think about is wealthy children. You'll find that there are very few children who actually possess great deals of wealth. Their family or their parents may possess a lot of wealth. That does not necessarily mean that is the child's wealth to spend. And again, this would leave the children vulnerable. God forbid they have a mental illness or they're declared incompetent by their parents, but let's move past that for a sec. That is also another form of control, where if someone is from a wealthy background, but they can only have access to that wealth if they perform certain actions, that is a form of financial control. And again, this is something you can do realistically, such as the only way I'm going to get my parents' inheritance is if I kill my cousin. Okay, fairly realistic. That is pretty much most of monarchistic history. Or then you can do something fictional with it. My parents are extraordinarily wealthy, and they'll only let me collect the wealth if I slay every curse that's haunting the family. And now that I say that out loud, even though it sounds like a joke, that is actually a story I want to do. Okay, write that down. That is a story that you can do. A family that is only going to pass on its wealth to you if you destroy every curse that is haunting that family. Now, related to financial control is restriction of leisure and freedom. Again, this is usually the form of things like, well, you can't watch those movies. You have to read the books with us. You can't go for a walk. We need you here with us, kinds of things. And this can also be used for time for group indoctrination increased, such as a group ritual. Let's say everyone goes around in a circle and shares something they did that week that earned their place in the world. So that way everyone has to constantly explain every day in a group to the group's approval that what they did in the world meant that they are allowed to exist in it. They also may restrict your leisure and freedom for individual rituals, such as, say, watching videos to make you more compliant with them, spending time reading from their books, or spending time doing a repetitive exercise that causes your mind to not necessarily focus on where you are at that time. Say, for example, baking pies for an entire neighborhood or making food for everyone. Again, comes down to severity and how often this is used. Someone who is going to make a pie for a group party is not necessarily someone who's in a cult. Someone who's baking a pie for a group every day for every event, regardless of time or how healthy they are, that is likely to be cult-like behavior. And again, these restrictions of leisures and freedom, it serves a few different purposes, makes you more dependent on the cult, and also makes it less likely for you to actually understand where you are, or for you to critically think about what you're doing. With less time for leisure and freedom, and more time with group indoctrination or individual indoctrination, you may find yourself starting to require permission for major decisions. Again, matters on severity and scale. For example, you being 8 years old and asking permission from your parents to get ice cream from the fridge is a form of behavioral control. It isn't really a cult-like behavior due to its severity, versus, say, being an 18-year-old having to ask your next-door neighbor permission for you to get ice cream from your own fridge. Again, you'll see stuff like that in diet culture. You'll see stuff like that in real life a lot, but people don't generally think about it that way. You may also find that requiring permission for major decisions will increase the level of what does or doesn't require permission as time goes on. So, for example, it may start with requiring permission to bring friends over to the house, to requiring permission to see your friends, to require permission to have friends. That is a real life example that you can use. You can also see other kinds of stuff in fiction or stuff you can make fictitious fairly easily. Requiring permission to, say, use the bathroom. Requiring permission to stand a certain way. Requiring permission to eat during the day. Or a real fun one, requiring permission to go see your family. Again, you'll see cult-like behavior like that all over the place, and to use a fictitious example, because I definitely don't have a sniper rifle trained on me right now when I say that this is 100% fictitious. Imagine working for an authoritative military, and you require permission from your officer just to send them a letter. Now imagine that they can revoke that permission at any time, even after your letter is already sent, and then they may decide, no, I don't actually like the letter you sent them, and we're going to make sure they don't read it, or we're going to censor parts of it. Yes, that example is 100% fictitious and has never been used by any military on the history of the planet. Okay, they're gone. Yes, that is a real example. But that does also lead me to the next subject. So it requires permission for major decisions. Well, with permission also comes something a little more esoteric. So once you now require permission for people to act a certain way, now you can also lead to the next part. Or I guess you could use this before requiring permission, but it does depend on the person, and it does depend on how you're doing it. So there are rewards and punishment for breaking and following rules. Now, rewards and punishments can take many different scales and take many different severities. You've probably learned that by now, but I'm still going to list a few examples. Say, for example, a child asks your permission before asking to cross the street. You may reward them by saying, yes, you may cross the street. Very simple reward, very simple form of behavioral control, and a very normal part of human socialization. And now imagine that reward in a much more severe scale. You have someone in their 30s who has studied nonstop for months and is now asking permission to sleep. You may reward them with an 8-hour sleep. Again, that leads back to regulating sleep and also regulating behavior. But then in that way, your behavior is literally letting them do a pretty basic thing. That's not a reward. That's a human right, according to the Bill of Human Rights, which I will talk about in another video, probably, at the rate I'm going. but that is something worth considering. Rewards may be used to entice people to do certain things, but punishments can as well. Using them together is usually how things happen. Again, punishments depend on severity of things. A child crossing a street without permission, the punishment may be as simple as grabbing the child, pulling them back, and remind them to ask to cross the street again. Or it could be something as severe as someone leaving their post at their job, so their job decides to execute for them for it. Again, it's a punishment. And again, and if there are punishments and rewards, there are also public and private punishments and rewards. Again, I'm going to point to a point of fiction for this. How many of you have read the book or actually seen Ender's Game? I'm going to assume some of you. So that it is pointed out a little bit better in the book than it is in the movie. But essentially, public awards can be used to motivate, but they can also be used to create divisions. So in the movie, when Ender laughs at seeing his officer floating, he asked, "Oh, do you think that's funny?" Everyone else going, "No, sir, that's not funny." Because again, and if you would publicly punish Ender or call him out on the, "Oh, you're laughing, ha ha, how funny is that?" then it actually can increase group cohesion. Because publicly punishing someone generally can bring the group closer together. Say generally, there are exceptions, people are complicated, situations are complicated. But if you publicly punish one person, make it clear what their crimes are, generally it gets the entire group to either think don't do what they did to avoid punishment because everyone will see it, or at the very least they will think don't do what they did and get caught. Again, it comes down to those kinds of things. Now, if you publicly reward them, depending on how it is, you may get people who will now want to act a certain way. So I'm going to use the same example. Say you punish someone publicly because they betrayed the group. And now you publicly reward the person who betrayed that person. Well, now you're going to actually encourage people to turn in other people around them who are betraying them. Whether or not those are actual betrayals is a separate thing. So again, depending on how things are, you may actually find public rewards are less common than public punishments. So again, it depends on your level of control. A group that is less authoritative may actually be publicly praised, but privately be punish or criticize. Because again, a private criticism can lead to things like, here's where I think you can improve, I think you did good here, let's see what we can do better here. It keeps the group from being angry at the individual and can give the individual an opportunity to grow. Publicly punishing them, on the other hand, will not allow them a chance to grow. Now, if you privately reward people, that can lead to some strange things depending on what exactly the award is. So if the reward is something like, "Oh, you did a good job at work, here's a raise," that's not likely to create too many issues. Versus "Okay, you did something you were supposed to, your reward is you get to eat a hot dog." Yeah, that's not likely to inspire too much. Unless you're in a pretty extreme diet cult. In that case, please get help. But again, public rewards and punishments can make or break group cohesion, and effective cult leaders will be aware of that. Effective writers will also know how to demonstrate that. So again, you can work those in. The best kinds of those, though, are those where the punishments and rewards are one and the same. So let's say, for example, you do have a death cult, one that believes that once they die, they immediately go to heaven. And you have someone who did something the group doesn't like. Well, now you're going to tell the group, well, this person's going to go to heaven. And then you publicly execute them. Those who do believe that they aren't go to heaven once they die will get to see someone unpraised and rewarded for that. And for those who don't buy into that dogma, will see, oh shoot, they're willing to kill people over this. Again, depends on how you use the rewards and punishments and whether or not you make them public or private. But again, for most cults and cult-like behaviors, the punishments and rewards will be public because that's the way you will get the group to behave the way you want them to behave. Now, past the rewards and punishments, you also will have cults that will try to discourage individualism and encourage groupthink. They will also break old bonds and relationships if at all possible, usually severing them from old communities or families, any support structures they had before, so they become dependent on the cult. Now, to explain what exactly I mean by discourage individualism, because again, some cults will say that they're very individualistic or try to encourage certain forms of individualism. The individualism they are discouraging is to discourage thinking of yourself as I am this person, and more of I am this person and I am part of this group. And again, with groupthink, it's less about please consider your community and everyone around you with your actions, and more of how does this benefit our group directly. And again, by breaking old bonds and relationships, this gets easier. Because again, if someone has a good support system or community outside of the cult, they are less likely to depend on the cult. Again, going to use some examples. Let's say it is a two-person cult and someone's in an abusive relationship. You will find people who are in abusive relationships will often have their abuser try to encourage or flat out force them to break old bonds with family members, coworkers, anyone who could potentially help get them out of the situation. Again, abusers will depend on the situation and severity, but will try to get them to start having those they are abusing depend on them. So with this is now done, the rules and regulations can become severe and arbitrary. And again, they have to not have a clear reason other than avoiding punishment. So with the individualism broken, they will now begin to have the behaviors bound the individual to the new group, usually illegal, immoral, or against the person's ethics. They will likely start small, but will escalate. Using some real-life examples, you may be asked to steal a candy bar from a convenience store, then you may ask to start stealing more from the store, to actually robbing the store, to maybe even murdering the person at the store during the robbery. Those are some real-life, easy, or realistic fiction examples. But again, that is one kind of behavior. If you want a historical behavior, how many of you heard of decamatio? It is an old practice, and I mean really old, that used to be practiced by the Romans with rebellious troops. They would organize the troops into groups of 10, and then they would have the troops vote on one member of their group to be executed, and then every other soldier, the other 9, would then beat that man to death. Again, there's been a few different versions of this throughout history. Some will use more formal executions. Some will sew them up into a bag of weasels and throw them into the river. If you want a real fun example, in fiction, there is World War Z, where the Russian army actually tries to rebel against the Russian government. So then the officers organized the troops into groups of 10, and then had the soldiers actually beat the one they voted on to death with a frickin' rock. So by doing it that way, it binds everyone together, and the book does a really good way of explaining how that actually bound everyone together. Because then at that point, they felt that they had the freedom to just point to their officers and say, I was just following orders. They could no longer think of themselves as individuals, just as members of their own army. And as you remember, in World War Z, the Russian government became the Holy Russian Empire by the end of that war. So that is a fun example of behaviors to bind the individual to the new group. Because again, if you're being asked to execute one of your people, it's a lot harder to run back to your family and ask them to help, especially when you have to tell them that you've killed someone. And again, that's done intentionally because it breaks your own ethics, and it will make you harder to leave, because if you leave, people are just as likely to turn on you. To explain what the heck that means, it can mean something as simple as you do a distasteful action in the cult, so now you depend on the cult to vindicate yourself, to even if you leave the cult and you admit to your crimes to help stop the cult, that means you will be punished as well. Well, if you've done something like rob from a store, now you're going to be punished for robbing the store if you leave your gang. If you had to kill someone in the group and then you leave, then you have to now be guilty of that death when you leave. Again, it's something that's done a lot, and it helps encourage loyalty because then the ways out become harder and harder to seek because it becomes that you will be punished if you leave, usually by the cult, but if the actions you do within the cult are bad enough, well, then even if you do leave, then you will be punished by groups outside the cult as well. Again, it's a cycle, and it is quite effective. Now, this leads to another aspect I want to talk about. Escalating behavior, or escalation in general, as a form of behavior control. It's a common trope, and with real good reason. If you walk up to someone and ask them to murder for you, they're likely not to do it. What you do is start small and you increase. So if you ask someone to, say, pick up a package for you, that's usually pretty easy. But then if you push boundaries where possible and move the window of what they are or what they are not comfortable with, especially with rewards and punishments, then it becomes easier and easier for them to do more and more extreme actions. Because again, sunk cost fallacy, the idea of you've already sunk so much energy into this, so if you stop sinking energy into this, then all the earlier energy is gone, is something that will be used to encourage people to act a certain way. I'm going to use an example. Say you're in a diet cult and they say, well, you've already lost 5 pounds. If you leave, you'll just gain those 5 pounds back. And it's like, well, I've already done all this. I might as well just stay. And again, that is a relatively innocuous example. There are more extreme behaviors. So let's say, for example, let's use the chanting king sacrifices, for example. So let's say, for example, you joined the cult because you wanted some sense of belonging there. They may start by asking you to get books or guard certain things. But then as time goes on, they might ask you to do more and more extreme things. They might ask you to drive a car while they're kidnapping someone. You may even convince yourself that you didn't do anything wrong, you just drove a car. Then they'll escalate it further and further. And again, they're going to start with small things where possible, and even things that do seem arbitrary. Say, for example, don't eat rice on Tuesdays. Does it make sense? And if it is something that you refuse early, well, then you leave the cult early before you see anything illegal or dangerous happening, so you're not likely to turn them in. Or if you do refuse and then still join back up with them, then it is a way for them to also isolate you from members of the cult. Oh yeah, this is the one who didn't listen to us when we said no rice on Tuesdays. Again, escalating behavior is something used a lot in fiction. Because again, things can start innocuous or small, and then they escalate quickly. After all, it may seem pretty simple, where it's like you make your bed just right, you take care of your rifle just well, and then before you know it, you're being asked to shoot an unarmed civilian. Well, you've already done everything else, so why not do this too? Or again, you may even think to yourself, well, I can't refuse because something bad will happen to me if they don't. And again, it is a form of escalation, and it is usually why groups start small. And it is something that you have to consider when in a group like this. Things like this will start small, and if you start to get uncomfortable with something, you can either push back or even walk away. So if the character gets the chance to walk away, you can have them walk away, or you can have them stay. But again, it depends on what kind of story you want to tell. Because if you have a story of a character who leaves right away before things get weird, how much of a story is there going to be? Again, depends on the way you want to tell your story. You can tell a story where someone thinks they're joining a club, finds out it's a cult, leaves, then finds out later that everyone in the cult dies. Again, that is a story you can tell, or you can tell many other strange things. And if they do escalate the behavior to the point where you are dependent enough on them and obedient enough to them, where you are killing for them, and you are scared of disobeying them out of fear of death or something much worse, there is very little they won't order you to do. So keep that in mind that they can and will. They'll order you to do anything as long as it either benefits them or helps them keep control over you. And now, 45 minutes into this video, we're done talking about behavior. Again, but you may find that it has a lot of overlap with the next part of BITE: information. Revise, control, and withhold. So that's withholding information and distorting information, or even framing information in certain ways to get people to be more loyal to you. And again, this can take many different forms. Sometimes it is as simple as just withholding information, not telling you everything, distorting information, that is telling you some of the information, but saying it in such a way that it is a flat out lie. Let's say, for example, they're withholding information. Let's use an example of withholding information. We're going to withhold the fact we have something tied up in the barn behind you. Distorting information. Yes, we have something tied up in the barn in there. It's a dangerous bull. Or framing information. Yeah, we have something tied up in the barn out there. It's extremely dangerous. Don't go near it. And then you find out what's behind there is an eldritch Lovecraftian god. Again, you'll notice the three different things. Withholding information, you just don't say it's there. Distorting information, you say something else entirely. Or framing information. You're giving them some accurate information, but it's far from the full truth. And again, these can take many different forms. So one common form of information control is systematic lying. This isn't just everyone in the entire system or cult lying, although that's definitely part of it. It's having all the lies of the cult feed into the lies earlier before. Using the example of the dangerous Lovecraftian god left in the barn. The cult has a dangerous Lovecraftian entity in the barn, but they're lying to you and saying it's a dangerous animal, such as a bull. So, with that in mind, there'll be other lies. Oh yeah, this here is for feeding the bull in the barn. Oh, this is so we make sure the bull doesn't get out. Oh, this is so that the bull doesn't bite anyone. Things like that. Any kinds of lies that feed into the other lies. It's a form of systematic lying. Again, comes into severity of things. But then again, there's not really a form of systematic lying that is healthy. So we do keep that in mind. And again, this does not necessarily mean the same as keeping a secret, because individuals are allowed to keep secrets. That being said, if an entire group is lying to you about something, there's usually going to be a reason why, and the reason is you never good. Another form of information control, this one everyone's familiar with. You discourage or restrict information from outside the group. Internet, TV, books, magazines, talking to other people, social media, things like that. Again, this can take many different forms and many different severities. It's quite common for many religious groups to discourage anyone to read a book outside their religious group. It is also quite common for parents to say to restrict certain movies from their children until they reach a certain age. Again, not really cult-like behavior, but it is a form of informational control. And then you have countrywide or greater, where books are banned from the entire country, movies and certain television shows are banned from the entire country, or even something as simple as an entire internet or websites banned from an entire country. Some countries will even go so far as to make their own internet to make sure it doesn't connect to anyone outside of their country. So by discouraging and restricting information outside the group, it means that information coming into the group is either from the group itself or information that the group itself approves of. That being said, in this day and age, it is extremely easy to usually get information outside the group, So cults have to get clever when restricting information from the outside, especially on the internet and especially on television. So do keep that in mind. So another part of restricting information, not just outside the group, but inside as well, is critical information is withheld. In a rules pasta, this could be the background consequences or the essential reasons why the rules exist. In a more realistic fiction, this could be things such as, oh, why does the cult why does the cult have all these drugs? Well, that information is on a need to know basis. Okay. Hey, why do we have all these weapons in this one location? That is a critical information you don't need to know. Again, this could be information inside the group or outside the group, but critical information that could change someone's mind or why they're there is withheld. In a storytelling procedure, this could be anything from dramatic irony to just figuring out the mystery. In the real world, this can be anything from the fact that the group that they are in is going to drain them of all their blood to the fact that they keep something dangerous behind the back shed. So again, if critical information is withheld, that is a form of informational control. And again, this also leads to the next part of informational control. The next part is the restriction away from former members, victims, exes, survivors, or experts of the cult or the cult-like behaviors. Again, depends on severity, and again, you're going to see it in a lot of different scales. In an abusive relationship, you may see it as someone saying, oh yeah, all my exes were crazy. They're going to try to get in contact with you and try to get you away from me. Please don't let them. Just block them right away. And they'll say anything they can to try to get back to me. They were that crazy. To something more severe, such as a don't trust scientists, don't trust doctors. They all have an agenda, and their agenda is not the best thing for you. So they're going to tell you all kinds of crazy things about what we're telling you. Don't listen to them because they have an agenda to get you away from us. Then it can also lead to things like survivors of the group, such as former religious members explaining why they left the religion. Members of that religion may actually actively keep former members from speaking to any present members. It's a form of informational control and behavior control. Because if you're talking to someone who is now outside the community, who was part of the community, that may make it easier for them to encourage you to leave. And again, by restricting them from certain members, usually former members, victims, but it can even just be experts, scientists, anyone outside, then it can become easier to do informational control. Again, it kind of depends on severity and also what the situation is. So if a family member is trying to keep you away from another family member who is a registered sex offender, there's probably good reason for them to keep you away. But again, they generally have a reason for that. But then again, even manipulative cults will have a reason, and they will say anything to make them seem reasonable. So again, this does require critical thought and critical information to actually examine if someone is or isn't dangerous to the group or individuals of that group. But if they're generally telling you that every expert is a dangerous person, that every person of this group is dangerous, or that every survivor, every ex, every former member, every former victim is someone who was dangerous or lying to you in some way, there's something wrong. If someone says an individual is dangerous, there may be some truth there. Then again, someone can be dangerous and also represent a way out of the cult. So that could be something fun to write, wouldn't it? Now, relating to what we discussed earlier about restriction of leisure time, luxury, and free time, is to keep members busy so they don't have time to think, investigate, or leave. It can relate to the lack of luxury, or it can even relate something directly to a benefit of the cult. Let's say, for example, you have a fictional cult that loves building temples in the forest. Well, if you keep cult members busy building the temples, they're going to have less time to question why you're building temples in the forest. They're going to have less time to wonder how they're going to escape. They also have less time to escape, and they have less time to talk to each other, and generally can keep them tired. It can even be a form of sleep control. Oh, you're always so tired because you're working so much, and then once you're done working, the only thing you have time for is rest. You've probably seen people speculate, I'm going to say, speculate that capitalism is keeping them so busy that they can't actually think enough to question it. That's the kind of model of thinking that a lot of information in control of cults does use, which is keeping people busy so they don't have time to think, investigate, or leave. It's also keeping them busy, usually to some benefit of the cult itself. Again, it could be anything from building temples. It could be, I need you to work 3 jobs to help sustain me and the kid. And it could be, I need you to dig up all these graves because we need all their toes. I don't know, I just made something up. But yeah, if you keep members busy, they have less time to think, and they have less time to critically analyze any information they do have. And if there's a lack of luxury and lack of outside information, this also means that they have less time to actually question the material that you do give them, especially if you're giving them only certain music to listen to, only certain actions to do, or only certain things to do. Again, it's a form of informational control, and it could be a form of physical control as well. Now, a rather advanced and relatively modern form of informational control is control through technology. Cell phones, emails, social media, instant messaging, tracking chips, and other similar means. Now, this is a fun one to think about when you're writing fiction, because a lot of technology exists conceptually, and that conceptual technology can make people very easily paranoid or very easily control where they are. Let's use, for an example, smart houses. So if you have a little box in your house that you can talk to at any time and can talk to you at any time, it can buy things for you. It can keep track of where you are. It can keep track of where your phone is. It can watch you through the cameras in your house. It can listen to you through the speakers in your house. It can watch you through your doorbell. It can keep track of where your car is. It can keep track of where your job is. It can keep track of your finances. It can keep track of your medical records. It can keep track of your family's medical records. It can keep track to who you're talking to. It can keep track to who you're not talking to. It can keep track of who you are speaking to publicly. It can keep track of who you're talking to privately. It can keep track of what you're posting on social media. It can keep track of what you're looking up on social media. It can keep track of what you are looking up online. It can keep track of what you are posting online. It can keep track of so much more. And again, none of those examples I've mentioned is fictional. A lot of control through technology, especially just observing people and keeping track of where they are, is so prevalent that a lot of people don't realize how bad the scaling really is. Where it is legitimately things like, well, your laptop's listening to you, your cell phone's listening to you, everything's listening to you. So it kind of reaches a point where it's not even paranoia at that point, because paranoia implies that it's irrational or based on something not real. Now, imagine even if a non-hostile actor had control over this, it would be bad. If you had a cult that had access to this, it would be extremely bad. Let's use that temple building in the forest cult as an example. Well, now, not only are they keeping track of what you're doing when you're working, they're also keeping track of you at home. They know how long you're in the shower. They know what you're looking up online. They know where you stand in the day. They know what you eat. They can control what you order. They can control your finances. They know exactly how much money you have, and they know how much money you're giving them. All of that through the power of technology. That is just based on real technology. Now, if we start doing on conceptual, speculative, or science fiction technology, then we can start talking about things like tracking chips, mind-reading devices, using those little devices to keep track of your heart rate, to keep track if you're lying or not. They can also use all kinds of crazy technology, maybe keep track of where you are at the home or if you're near any other people's homes. Maybe even just bring a device to other people's homes and then hack their tech as well to keep an eye on them. Again, this control through technology can get pretty extreme. And again, that's just on one side of the scale. Even if you go extremely small scale and just say, well, I just followed them online, that's where I'm at. There was a Disney live action cartoon mix. I believe it was the Rescuers, Chip and Dale the Rescuers. The live action one they did a while back, where the bad guy, when they're like, well, should we leave town for a little bit? It's like, no, I know exactly how to do it. And he just followed one of the people online that was chasing him. And that's it. That's all he had to do to learn where that location was, learn what they were doing, and learn what they were planning. A lot of people will post stuff online, and that can be a form of informational control because then people, your cult can see where you are. Or you can also use it in the other end. They can control what you post. They control what you say. They control how people perceive you online, which in this day and age, the way you are online is a big part of who you are. So again, that form of informational control through technology can get pretty extreme. They can even do simple things like request that you only go to certain sites, request that you only go to certain things. And again, with parental blocks and similar programs, you can track people's phones. You can even keep track of who they call and what they are or are not allowed to say. Now, to the best of my knowledge, these programs are not allowed to keep you from calling 911 or similar emergency services. That being said, sometimes that idea exists pretty easily in fiction. So that could also be a form of informational control. If the phone you have is through the cult, you might not even have the means of calling out for help. And again, this is just based on stuff that can exist. If we're trying to base it off stuff that cannot exist at this point, then things get extremely crazy. We could start talking about using phones to summon eldritch things. We could start or talking about people teleporting place to place just based on knowing where you are. Now, that control through technology can get extremely creepy extremely quickly. So do be careful with your technology and do be aware of how people can use it against you, especially before we lead to our next question. Another form of information control is the insider and outsider mentality. These aren't always strict boxes of there's us and them, although that does happen a lot. There can also be a series of Venn diagrams of people who are in on some information, but not others. So you create the mentality of outsiders cannot understand, and only those inside your circle can understand, care about, or respect you. Possibly with the promise of further information or rewards the closer you get to the inner circle. Information is not freely accessible in this model, and it can be offered on different levels and different missions. In essence, a need to know basis. It can be something like corporate with proprietary information, military with top secret, to just secret recipes. But again, this insider versus outsider mentality makes it easier to control information and make sure that you get certain information in or out. For example, maybe something like, well, that information comes from the outside, so we can't trust it, to, well, this information came from the inside, so we can trust it, to, well, this person is in this part of the circle, but not that part of the circle, so we can trust some of what they say, but not all of what they say. Or we might be able to use this person, but we're not certain. And again, it can come with severity, but again, that insider-outsider mentality is practiced a lot in human socialization. You'll even see it in sports teams or even just the idea of just people manipulating schools as a whole. Sport teams is a fun example of the insider-outsider mentality. I love my sports team, so therefore I hate yours because your team is outside my team. Some people like multiple teams. Some people just like to see the game. But again, that insider-outsider mentality is often encouraged. And you can see it encouraged there. And it can actually give you a pretty decent idea of how the cults work with their insider-outsider mentality. Get certain colors, symbols, words to associate with a team. You can even get people to associate the team as being on your side, even if people on the team itself are completely replaced or join other teams. You may have one year that someone supports the green team, but then all the members of the green team join the red team, and then all the members of the red team join the green team. So even though essentially the teams have switched, people may still find themselves supporting the green team because the green team is their team. So with that that is a pretty basic idea of the insider-outsider mentality, but it is quite effective. You will even see it in horror and writing a lot. The idea of that people who have not encountered the supernatural cannot understand the supernatural, or the idea that you have to keep the public guarded against certain information that you yourself are aware of, because there's someone who is outside of this world. Again, it's an interesting thought process, but it is one that occurs a lot and is worth thinking about. Because again, the insider-outsider mentality may literally be something as simple as this is a secret recipe, you don't share it, or it may be something as extreme as they can never understand the idea of a Nissa because they have never encountered a supernatural creature before. And again, this is also a form of informational control because information is not freely accessible. It has to be always shared with the insiders, and the outsiders' information cannot be helpful. And again, even if your cult is dealing with something supernatural, it does not mean that the outsiders are ill-equipped to assist or even combat the supernatural threat. So it's something worth knowing about and thinking about. And relating to the idea of insider and outsider is the idea of secrets. Certain people in the cult are allowed to keep secrets, and certain people are not allowed to keep secrets. Oftentimes, you will find that leadership decides what is or isn't allowed to be a secret, and you will be asked to give up all of yours, and leadership is allowed to keep theirs. The information is always exchanged from members to leadership, or in the case of abusive relationships, usually from the abused to the abuser. Again, any kinds of secrets here are either framed in such a way that they're not the real actual secret, or they're framed in a way that makes the cult leader look more sympathetic or empathetic to them. This is something worth considering, especially when writing fictional stories. If you have a leader of a cult act or bad guys explaining why they're doing things, you may actually listen to their story and then realize they're trying to paint themselves in a more sympathetic light. What gets real interesting is when someone tries to paint themselves in a more sympathetic light, and then by the end of it, you're like, no, you're still the asshole. You were the asshole in that entire story. What the hell were you thinking? And again, secrets are interesting like that. Because again, leadership will ask you to give up yours, and leadership is allowed to keep theirs. And again, this depends on various degrees of severity and scale. So, for example, a company may ask for your credit score just to verify that you don't have immense debts to someone else to make sure that you wouldn't sell their secrets for something else. And then again, it may be something more severe, like someone's asking for your sexual history, or they will ask for or every ask where you keep your passwords and where you keep your money. And again, they will frame this in all kinds of ways, including, well, there are no secrets here, or your secrets can be dangerous for us. And again, you may be asked to give up your secrets, or they may be asked to giving up your thoughts. The more they know about you, the easier they can manipulate you, especially when it relates to emotion, discussed later. Okay, so that also leads to the next part of leadership deciding what is or isn't allowed to be known. This is usually not a democratic process, or if it is democratic, it's with upper leadership, and it's not handled by specialties or scientists or other experts. And again, depends on severity and depends on scaling, because again, by this definition right here, you could argue education is itself a form of information control. It is. And again, even then, education may dictate what it considers to be the most important thing for people to know at certain times. It does not necessarily mean that this is the only thing that they're allowed to know. And again, depends on how you're educated and depends on how education works. But generally, cults decide information that you are allowed to learn. If you try to learn information that is outside what is allowed, they will often punish or flat out restrict that information of what is or isn't allowed. So let's say, for example, we're talking about the cult building temples in the forest. So they might decide that it's good for you to learn architecture and engineering so you can build these temples more effectively. But they actually restrict you from learning the history of these temples that you're looking up. So now you're learning a bunch of architecture and you're learning a bunch of construction practices and how they're built, but you aren't actually learning where they were built, why they were built, or who built them. That is the best example I can think of information on what is or isn't known. You will find strange barriers behind information of what you are or are not allowed to know, and it will oftentimes seem arbitrary from your angle. So again, you might be encouraged to learn how to cook certain things, but you're actually restricted from watching in television because those cooking shows are a little too diverse. Yes, I'm hinting at an actual thing, but I don't know what I'm hinting at right now. And again, this is something that you'll see a lot. So leadership decides what is or isn't allowed to be known, and then you aren't actually allowed any input on what you are or are not allowed to know or learn. And this is generally how you can tell the difference between someone who is a teacher and someone who is a cult leader. Because again, most people who want people to learn something may focus on certain subjects, but when you ask questions or you show curiosity, they will encourage that curiosity versus someone shutting down that curiosity or giving a short, often blunt answer, or even just flat out saying, you don't need to know that, or you don't need to know that right now, while they move on into information that you do know. And again, this is something that can definitely be interesting in fiction. Because can you imagine trying to run an entire society where people are only required to know the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mechanics, of how to build something, but they're not actually learn about the humanity or the arts behind why they were built in certain ways. Could you imagine trying to build entire structures without trying to figure out why they were built that way? Or trying to explain to someone why science is done a certain way, not explaining where that science was learned or why someone would learn that science. After all, it's real easy to explain how vaccination works. It's a lot harder to explain the second vaccine ever designed was a rabies vaccine and saved so many lives that the man who invented it was a hero around the entire world. Because again, you can consider that a form of informational control by leadership. You're allowed to know some things, but not everything connected to it. And again, it's worth considering and it's worth examining in critical thought. And again, you also have to consider, is leadership actually keeping this information from you? Or has everyone just decided this information was just not useful for so long that everyone just assumed that this information was banned in some way? Think about it and critically analyze it, especially when you're trying to examine what information is outside the group. Okay, so now that leads us to the next part. So once the cult decides what information is or isn't allowed to be known, now you have information generated by the cult or the leaders itself. Now this information can be the primary or only source of information. And again, related to insider and outsider information you're going to use to bring people into the cult, such as pamphlets, posters, those kinds of things, is going to look very different from propaganda that is produced within the cult to members of the cult. And again, this is information generated by the cult as a primary or only source of information. Now, this can take many, many, many different forms. Posters, video, radio, art, magazines, newspapers, social media, television shows, movies. Depending on the scale, they may be the size of industries or something as small as an indie published book. And again, this can take many different forms and many different things. Again, there are entire industries for religious groups where just based around these religious groups make religious movies for religious members. That is an example of information generated by the cult. It is often intended to be the primary and only source of information about certain subjects. You see that a lot in the God's Not Dead franchise, which, yes, I recognize is a real thing. And if you try to examine any of those movies as an outsider, you're going to be really confused, especially when they break many basic storytelling aspects. But I'm not a critic here, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. But again, that is an example of an entire industry generated by a cult for information for the cult. That information is not really intended to go out and spread the cult's message. That information is made to reinforce the cult's message. But again, there will be propaganda generated to try to get people into the cult as well. This may be more subtle, but not necessarily less effective methods. Using, we'll say, the movie industry as an example, you may start generating stories that contain angels in them as good guys and demons as bad guys. And then just generally get people to become more and more accepting of the idea of this is what an angel looks like. This is how you summon an angel. This is what an angel does. This is what it does for you. Things like that. Again, it's worth considering. Again, that's an idea of how to get people into the cult from the outside, using information generated inside the cult. And again, depending on the size of the cult and its industry, they may generate entire movies, books, newspapers, social medias, all those things as alternatives, publicly available ones, or they may just generate it as a means of generating income. Again, that is also a way that some of these cults operate. They just make these movies. Some of these industries may make movies because they believe in it. Some of these industries make these movies because there's good money in it. Some do both. And again, that's just based on real things. Now, if you're going to do something fictional, that's where things can get real interesting. You can get things where, like, say, there are movies people are required to watch, and those movies induce a hypnotic state in people. You may make it where there are these special posters that watch people, and then everyone who sees these posters get watched. You may do a thing where people are required to have a certain social media or like a certain social media thing, because if that social media thing isn't liked, then it can spread amongst them. And again, it depends on scale and how realistic or unrealistic of a fiction you want to go. Thing is, that kind of information generated within the cult can also be difficult, especially when information outside the cult looks like it's supporting the information inside the cult. Now, information from external cult sources can also be misquoted, framed differently, or flat out stolen and used by the cult to act like it's support for the cult. This is where things get incredibly manipulative, because again, most people don't even realize this is what's happening while it's happening, and then you may find that something is actually misused so often, the misuse becomes the intended use. So let's use an example here. Let's say a religious belief system adopts another person's god and claims that, oh, actually this god you're worshiping was a demon, and our god killed this demon, so now our god's stronger than yours. Again, that's used a lot, but is something that is an example of something being misquoted or framed differently. You may take a literal quote from, say, an expert or something, either change the words or even flat out make a false statement from them. And then suddenly, it makes it look like support for the cult is a good thing. In this day and age of deep fakes and AI-generated whatever, this can be used quite maliciously, quite effectively, quite quickly. Or quotes can also be framed differently or misquoted. Let's say, for example, someone says, this is one of the games of the year. And then somebody says, oh, they said this was one of the best games of the year. And you can see from here that it just says, this is game of the year as the actual quote. You'll see that a lot in advertisements, especially for things that are praising it. It will cut out a lot of the little praise and take out any subtlety of those things. And then you will also find more insidious things than just quotes that are taken out of context. You will find that there is scientific language, psychological language, medical language, pseudoscience, historical, well, false history, alternative facts, folklore, urban legends or myths, and personal anecdotes, all used to support the cult or support a certain cult-like behavior. You see that a lot in psychological language, which I'm actually going to talk about a little bit. So, a fun example to think about is gaslighting. Gaslighting is a very specific psychological term where you make someone believe that their reality is false or that they are going insane in some way. It is from a movie where a husband actually keeps decreasing the brightness of the gas light in his living room, but his wife keeps asking, "Is that light? Why is that light dim?" And then he tells her that light is not dim. That is where gaslighting comes from. Gaslighting is not the same thing as lying to someone, playing a trick on someone, or anything like that. It is a process that takes months or even years to do, where you make someone question their reality and sanity so much that they believe that they are now insane. And trust me, once you believe you are insane, then there is effectively little difference from actually being insane. And again, that is just gaslighting. There are lots of other terms that can be adopted, abused, and used incorrectly. And then when that becomes essentially unusable for its original use, it can be used by the cult. Let's say, for an example, the term Darwinism. The term Darwinism is, again, in highly simplistic terms, the belief that species can change over time by either adapting to their environment or their environment adapting to them. It's effective, it's important for the theory of evolution and speciesism. Well, then some people start using the term social Darwinism, which then becomes this racist belief that some cultures and races are just naturally inferior to others, and others are more superior because they dominate and destroy them. It becomes a means of justifying racism, colonialism, enslavement, because after all, if it's natural for a species to do it, why is it not natural for humanity to do it to itself? Again, that is taking something out of its context and making it into something completely different. It is something worth considering when you're dealing with information from outside a cult that is misquoted, framed differently, or stolen. It can be used to make it feel like the outside sources support the cult or the cult's rightness. It can even take information that is technically accurate that can be used to create propaganda. Say, for example, the chemical dihydrogen monoxide. It has the highest pH of any acid, and it is present across most of the Earth's crust, and everyone who has ever consumed it has died at some point in their life. That is all technically accurate. Dihydrogen monoxide is the word for water. You will actually find people who did the dihydrogen monoxide thing to generally make people aware of the fact that like making things sound chemical or weird in some way is a great way to have people turn against it. Because again, if you don't know that dihydrogen monoxide is water, then you aren't aware that people are talking about water. So you can use something like that and for your cult to try to make it seem more relevant or right in some way. And again, even if the information they have is accurate, that does not justify what they do to you or what they do to others. Even if Dagon is really out there in the oceans and really sinking ships, that does not justify kidnapping people to try to keep Dagon fed. This is something worth considering when dealing with cults and information control. Even if the information is accurate, it does not mean that the information control is necessary nor correct to do. Another form of informational control is unethical use of confession to withhold forgiveness, using past transgressions, both real and imagined, creating false memories or history where possible. And they will try to use the confession to disrupt or dissolve identity with confessions of sin or crimes, such as, "You stole candy from a store, why would we trust a thief?" essentially reducing your identity to a thief, whether or not that is or isn't warranted. That does not mean that you don't deserve an identity or a belief that you were once an outsider, so why would we trust you? Or you told me that you had doubts, so this is just more doubt. And again, that is an unethical use of confession or even use of your secrets against you. So if you try talking to a personal friend in a friend group about something you doubt the group is doing, and then they share that information with the rest of the group, that would be an unethical use of your confession and can be used against you. You see that in things like The Craft, but you also see that a lot in teenage drama. Quite frankly, you see that way too much in teenage drama, or just in real life. Just people taking things you said in confidence and using it against you. And again, it all depends on a manner of scaling. If you confess to your friend that you don't like blueberries and they told another friend that you don't like blueberries, that's not necessarily the nicest thing ever, but that's also not the same thing as an unethical use of confession. Versus, say, you're telling someone that you had thoughts of suicide and you feel depressed whenever that happens. So then they tell someone else, and that person then tries to encourage you to take your own life. And that would be a highly unethical use of confession and is a form of manipulation. Although I guess that's more behavioral than informational, but it's taking information that you gave them. Now, with informational control, especially information generated by the cult, a lot of it comes down to a question of scaling. Children are especially vulnerable when you can create cartoons with morals and lessons that can range from helpful in some situations to misguided but trying to flat out dangerous lessons. Going to use some examples from the olden days. A lesson of tell an adult that you see a weapon out on the street makes sense, helpful in most situations, and can definitely, it's better than having the child, pick up the gun and use it. And then there are those that are misguided but trying. Let's just say, for example, you have a superhero cartoon where there's a conflict between the leader of the group and those who follow them. And those who follow them are like, well, we want to go our own way. So then they do, and then they realize the leader of the group was right about everything, so they come back swearing to always listen to the leader of the group no matter what. Again, they're trying, especially considering the age, but there's definitely critical thought and questioning that needs to be done for a healthy person and for a healthy society. And then there are the flat out dangerous lessons, and I'm going to use some fictional examples. Who here is familiar with SCP-990? SCP-990 is a figure that will appear in your dreams, often with a lesson or warning about the future that you are expected to immediately prepare against to keep the future from occurring. With that in mind, it can be a dangerous moral, the idea of you can't ever question the future and you always have to listen to someone so that they listen. And again, that one's not really aimed towards children, but you will find lessons like that all the time. For a lot of small children's things where it's just like, well, why aren't you allowed to question? Well, you always listen to your parents. Good children always listen to their parents. Things like that. And the thing is, children aren't the only one vulnerable to these kinds of lessons. Even adults are vulnerable to those kinds of lessons. People love to have stories with morals, even if the morals aren't directly stated. But if you show people enough movies where an outsider is a bad guy enough, eventually they think every outsider is dangerous. And again, it doesn't just have to be an outsider of your specific cult. It can be something subtle or wider ranging. If you show enough movies where people from Russia are the bad guy, that's what they're always going to think. If you show enough movies where people from Mexico are always gangsters or drug dealers, then that's what they're always going to think. And again, this can be something as small as a puppet show for children to something as major as a multi-billion-dollar franchise about superheroes. Going to poke at the MCU for a second there, you can probably notice a pattern with who the villains are and the fact that villains are often killed off immediately by the end of the movie every single time, regardless of whether or not the villain is that villainous or whether or not the villain is someone that deserves their punishment or not. And again, this is an idea of informational control, and it is a massive scaling, even if it is more subtle than, say, a flashing video that says good is good, bad is bad. But again, it's something worth considering because it is a form of information control and is something worth considering. It's something I consider a lot with my writing too, which is what kind of lesson am I trying to convey here? What kind of lesson are they going to receive? Because again, the information I give in the story, I have to assume that's all the information they have on my story. I can't assume someone's going to listen to one story and know every other story I'm talking about. And again, that's a question of scaling. I'm a very small scale YouTuber. My lessons and morals are generally pretty straightforward, if there are any in the story. A lot of them is just scary thing is scary, move on. But again, if what I display as something scary, why it's scary, is the information that I'm showing. Is it scary because it looks scary, or is it scary because of something it did? Is it scary because people think it's scary, or is it scary because of how it acts? Again, these are subjects we're thinking about when you're writing these kinds of informational control. What is the scaling of the informational control? Something as simple as, please don't use racial slurs on a public place, is very low scale information behavioral control. Versus every day at 8 a.m. you have to post how happy you are, and every day at 8 p.m. you have to post how much you hate these people, is a very extreme form of informational control. So again, consider the scaling of these things when you're doing them. The next part of the BITE model is thought control. Once you've established a control over behavior and a control over information, then thought control becomes much easier. The goals of thought control is to stop certain thoughts and to make people police their own thoughts. Again, this seems tricky and can seem very nebulous. It's outside the world of fiction, because after all, how do you stop people from thinking thoughts? Do you actually put a tiny policeman in their head? Do you put a control chip in their head that shocks them every time they think something wrong? Do you have someone following them constantly, yelling at them whenever they do something bad? Again, those are all kinds of different fictional forms of thought control. But again, if you actually look into how it really works, things can get pretty bad really quick. Because once you've established outsider and insider mentality, then you can define the next part. Once you've established the firm line of who is an insider and who is an outsider, then you define what is or isn't good and what is or isn't evil by those same lines. Again, you're going to see all kinds of different ways that this is done, because it's done in many different ways. But generally, the idea of the group you're with is good. So therefore, what the things you do is good. And the group, and those who are outside the group are bad, and the things they do are bad. And again, there can be things in between this. There can be things such as, my group is good. Most people are not good because they're not part of the group, but they are not evil. This group over here that is trying to stop us is evil because they are trying to stop us. Again, you reduce a outsider-insider mentality into a good or bad mentality. The mentality of they are not on my team, so they are bad, that kind of thinking. And again, once you start defining good or evil by the insider-outsider mentality, then it becomes a little easier to start making people think in black and white. So black and white thinking is the thought process of things are either good or they are bad. There is no shades of gray, meaning there is some good with the bad or bad with the good. There is no pros and cons to a situation. Their situation is either good or it is bad. And again, the shades of gray don't exist in the cult, or more likely, they're going to say there are no shades of gray in this situation that the cult is either dealing with, or the cult is having you deal with. So, for example, they may say things like, of course we believe in the law and fair trial, but not for these criminals. They don't deserve a trial. Their crime is so great they don't deserve a trial. Their crime is so great that execution should be immediate. Their crime is so great they deserve to die right away. Again, a very black and white thinking. No, they don't deserve a chance to explain themselves. No, they don't deserve this. No, they don't deserve food. No, they don't deserve penance. No, they don't deserve a way out. Things like that. They think they can think things like they're a demon. I don't listen to demons. It can be a thought process of there is no neutrality in this war. You're with us or you're against us. Again, it's a very black and white thinking, and they think that way for a reason because it's easier to reinforce things. Just the everything I do is good because I am a good person. Therefore, I cannot do something bad. This is a very dangerous way of thinking because it's not just I can only do good things because I'm a good person. It's everything I do is good because I'm a good person. Everything my country does is good because I live in a good country. Good people don't do bad things, so they couldn't have done what you did. And again, this kind of justification can go in many extremes. It can go in a war where no matter what I do to the other person, it's not as bad as what they would have done to me. So everything I do is good. And it can also go in the other way. Everything they do is bad. So even if they do something good, that is just another form of bad. No, they were serving food for, I don't care if they were serving food for 3,000 people. They deserve to die because they were on the bad side, even if all they were doing was serving food for someone else. Or it can even, or this cognitive dissonance. Basically, cognitive dissonance is a disconnect in logic in the brain to make something fit. Again, I could do a whole video on that. It's another time. But this black and white cognitive dissonance can be something like, I like this person's art, writing, story, movies, music. So they couldn't have committed sexual assault. They couldn't have committed crimes. They couldn't have done anything bad because I like their art. Or it can also go the other way of course this person did something bad. They are clearly a bad person. Haven't you seen the writing they've done, the art they've done, the radio they've done, all those things I just happen to dislike. Also prove that this person was a bad person, and now there's evidence showing that they're a bad person, so of course I was vindicated the entire time. Or even things like, of course this person's actually a creep. Haven't you seen their writing? Of course they're a creep. Haven't you seen what they're wearing? Of course they're a creep. Haven't you seen how they're dressed? This very black and white thinking of there is good and there is bad in the world, and these are very clearly defined lines of what is or isn't good. And my cult is good, and everyone else is bad. Because again, even the worst, most vile people in the world that you are aware of still think of themselves as good. They still have those rules they do not cross, and they still have people that they think are clearly worse than they are, and clearly bad while they are good. These kinds of things can lead to mentalities of this crime is for unforgivable, and they know someone who did a crime, so they are unforgivable, or even just a person knowing someone associated with a crime can make someone bad. Extenuating circumstances or investigation, or even just calling for mercy, makes you just as bad as the bad guys you are defending. Even if it's something as simple as, I don't think we should hang someone for stealing, well then clearly you're just as bad as the thief. And again, it's kind of what causes mob justice mentality and psychology to work so effectively. Because you don't have to convince just one person. If you convince enough people in the crowd to cheer for you, then everyone around them will assume everyone's into it, so they just join up. So again, this black and white thinking can make things a lot easier to control how someone thinks. Even if they are not physically within your view or physically near you, you can help control what they're thinking. If you can define for them what is or isn't good, and make them think that things are only purely good, purely evil. Another aspect of thought control related to the black and white thinking is that any thought process, belief system, or critical thought is illegitimate, evil, bad, or at least not useful. It can depend on scaling, because it can be anything from, well, the Joneses are a different family from us, so we don't need to celebrate New Year's the same way as they do. And it can scale into things like any religion outside of our own religion is satanic, pagan, demon worship, or witchcraft. Don't ever try to learn about it. Don't even say its name, or you'll bring evil into its heart. And again, that is just another form of thought control of like any alternative or outsider information is illegitimate in some way. You even see this kind of thing when people are teaching different business models. They'll tell you that you have to use something like, say, agile business, or you have to use something like a traditional business, or you have to use something as a startup business kind of model. And they'll tell you that the other models are illegitimate or don't have useful things. And again, the models can be effective in some ways, or they could be ill-effective in some ways. But anything that is generally teaching you that any alternative thought process, belief system, or looking at something differently is illegitimate, evil, or, not useful, that's definitely should be raising a few red flags. Because again, being able to examine something from a different angle should be something that should be celebrated. Sometimes you'll learn something new by looking at it in a different way. Sometimes you'll learn something different by thinking about it differently. And sometimes you think about it differently and it just reinforces what you already know. And that's okay too. Just exploring things and being curious about things and looking at different perspectives is very human and very social and should definitely be encouraged. So anything that is trying to get you to not think in that way or not think in new ways is something that should be raising a red flag. Even groups that say they are free thinking but only encourage you to think in a certain way is itself pretty messed up. Again, I realize the irony of this because I am talking about a model while talking about that examining models from a different perspective being considered evil is a sign of it being bad. But I do have a point here, which is just there are other models, there are other ways to think about things, and thinking about things in new ways should be encouraged. And if it's being discouraged, that is a form of thought control. Another form of thought control is a hyper-focus on symbols, colors, or anything to disable a sense of individuality or camaraderie with an enemy. So let's say, for an example, flags. Flags are a great example of a symbol or color that generally makes people feel like they are part of a group or that someone is part of a different group from them. And again, it really depends on scaling because it could literally just be like, this flag represents my country. This flag represents my spectrum. This flag represents my neurodivergence. This flag represents where I am in the queer spectrum. This flag represents a faction I like in Warhammer 40K. And again, those are just relatively harmless examples. But again, that is still a form of thought control. You see this symbol and you think this symbol represents this person or this group. Again, if it's just this represents this group or this person, that's it and that's it. It's pretty straightforward. It's a relatively small example of thought control, but pretty harmless. However, if you start seeing things like this symbol represents an enemy, this symbol represents your side, this symbol represents an officer, this symbol represents a leader, this symbol represents an enemy leader, how quickly do you see a potential friend as an enemy when they're on an opposing side? How quickly do you lose your friend when you see them on the other side of, say, capture the flag? What if that the flag game just never ends? Do you still see them as a friend, or do they just become your forever enemy? And again, that's just based on symbols or colors. Getting people to associate with a symbol is generally a big form of thought control. And again, it is so widely practiced and common that it can legitimately become a threat very quickly. Again, I am queer. I am part of the autistic spectrum. I am a big fan of flags and symbols, especially in video games. I have at least two flags in my house, so that lets you know how much I love flags. But at the same time, it does make you think where is this making me shut down a critical thought process, or is this something I like because I like it? So again, if you become aware that your critical thought towards a symbol just becomes this symbol means this and that's it, that is a form of thought control and definitely something you should think about and critically analyze before things escalate. Another form of thought control related to symbols and colors is the use of mottos, mantras, cliches, loaded language, or other language to restrict critical thought or understanding. Language is a funny thing. It is used to communicate, and it can also be used to restrict certain forms of thought. In 1984, they would talk about newspeak, the idea of simplifying language until the point that that newspeak was supposed to replace all other language. So things just became good, double plus good, and triple good, things like that. Just things to simplify things without critical understanding or just using superfluous language. But again, when using loaded language can be anything from taking a euphemism, clinical language, or an anti-conflictive language to restrict an understanding of a situation. Again, someone using different terms from you or using euphemism is not necessarily the same thing as thought control, unless it's being used to replace critical thought and understanding, reducing complex subjects and thoughts into simple platitudes to placate you. Say, for example, you say you're struggling with life and someone just says, eat, pray, love, live, laugh, love, those kinds of things, as a response to you saying they're struggling. That is a form of informational control. They aren't actually letting you convey what's difficult. They aren't actually letting you convey a complex thought. They are just giving a simple answer that's not actually helpful in the situation. It makes it sound like it's helpful. And again, this can also be related to what we talked about earlier as a form of, infor- of informational control, where you're taking insider or outsider information and then you're changing it into something else. So taking a quote and then turning it into a platitude isn't going to be helpful, and this can actually help constrict thoughts. So let's use some examples of euphemistic and clinical language. So let's say I say your father is sleeping with the fishes. Well, that gives you a mentality that he's dead. If I say he kicked the oxygen habit, same thing. If I say his respiration is at zero, a little clinical, but it's got the idea. He's resting, but he stopped waking up. Again, simplifies it down to that. And then you can also have he has perished due to a firearm related discharge while in the vicinity of the police. Well, when I say it that way, it makes it hard to actually understand was like, yeah, he was shot by the police. But if I reduce it into that language, well then suddenly it shuts down your critical thought of maybe the police were involved here. You can see it a lot in how deaths are reported. Not all cliches and euphemisms are designed for critical thought, nor is it always their intent to shut down critical thought. But when you find a complex subject or an emotionally charged subject is always getting reduced to euphemism, it may be worth examining why. Why is there a taboo about death in your family? Why do you not talk about this one person? Why does no one talk about Bruno but immediately have a song ready on hand? That is actually a great example of this. They don't talk about him, but they have an entire song just talking about him, reducing him down to a monster in the closet. So if people in your family keep getting fast-tracked for heaven in quick succession, it might be worth examining why. And a doctor using clinical language to describe a life-threatening disease isn't necessarily them trying to indoctrinate you, but it is a form of thought control, and it may even be healthy in certain human relationships to do to some extent. Choosing certain language is not necessarily always manipulative, or at the very least not manipulative in joining a cult. Someone saying, your day fucking sucks is very different from say, I'm sorry you had a rough day. Again, changing the wording a little bit, it can help make social things work a little better. But if you reduce everything to a motto, cliche, or certain language, it can be difficult to convey certain things. You can even see it in the other direction too. People who communicate solely through swears or solely using rude or aggressive language. Well, it seems like that might be more honest at first until you realize they only communicate rudely. There is no place to just say things like, thank you for this, or may I please have this, or can we do it this way, or even just an honest, critical conversation, or just people talking about things in an emotionally mature way. There is a story once, I'm not sure how true it is, but I'm going to share it anyway, about a GI back in World War II who once a month would eat lunch in the women's cafeteria. The reason he would do that is not because he wanted to flirt with anyone or sleep with anyone, but just because he wanted one day a month where he would just hear someone say, "Can you please pass the butter?" rather than someone yelling at him to pass the grease. Again, it's something worth considering, just this idea of what language are you using, and is that language shutting down certain thoughts or thought processes? If you're always using aggressive language to always make everyone around you rounded up, that is a type of thought control. If you find yourself always using pessimistic or pacifistic language without any room for conflict or positivity, you also are in a form of thought control. Or if everything you have to talk about is always optimistic and happy and there is no place for sadness or anger or upset, you are also in a form of thought control. Again, it's an interesting thing. All these emotions are normal human emotions. And if you are in a place where you can't discuss some of it, because even discussing it is going to get you in trouble or violate a rule in some way, it may be worth examining why and where you can go that would let you express those thoughts freely. Now let's talk about another form of thought control, changing your name or identity. So the cult may change your name or identity, either against your will, everyone just starts addressing you by the new name without your consent, or by endlessly encouraging you to do so. Examples may include either calling you by your spouse's last name after you married, even if you didn't change your name. It may be calling you by a dead name if you're trans, or even giving you a name that doesn't fit your gender identity. It may also be by giving you a nickname or a name that you didn't ask people to call you by. Again, it's a question of scaling when we're dealing with names. Someone accidentally calling you a nickname that you didn't like once, but correcting it immediately is uncomfortable, but it isn't a form of thought control. So accidentally calling someone Billy when they prefer Bill and then not doing it again, not a form of thought control. If you do it endlessly, no matter how many times they correct you, depending on whether you're the person's boss or just a random stranger on the street, can either make you an asshole or it can make you more akin to a cult leader. And again, it's a question of scaling and also how often it's done. And because again, patterns also show how much this is done. So, for example, if a company only calls you by your dead name, only pays you in checks to your dead name, only giving you projects when you call yourself by your dead name, that is absolutely controlling behavior and is absolutely a form of thought control. Again, that's just if you're trans. There's lots of different examples of name changes as a form of control. A fun example in history is when lots of Native Americans were formally baptized by the church. They were given new names once they were baptized. And lots of times their old names or the names they actually called themselves weren't even recorded. So they are quite literally erasing the person's name from history and forever addressing them by a different name, which they may not have even wanted that name. And again, we can get much, much worse examples with colonialism, such as residency schools for indigenous populations, where people are forced to change their names, forced not to speak their language, forced to dress how the teachers wanted them to dress, with a mentality of kill the Indian but save the child. Sound familiar with that insider-outsider mentality? And this mentality is not exclusive to how Native Americans are and were treated, but it is a prominent example of changing an identity and a name. Because again, those two are going hand in hand. So changing someone's name against their will is a form of thought control and a way of breaking them into the cult or the belief system. Because again, if everyone in the cult is given a certain name or given names of a certain type, then it changes things. There was a comedy, I think it was 80s or 90s, I don't know, about Bubble Boy, a boy who was like running around in a bubble. He ran across an actual cult. All the girls had to have one name and all the boys had to have one name too. So it was literally like, oh, hi Todd, hi Todd, hi Todd, kind of thing. Or even with the Barbie movie, which is played for laughs, but it does get creepy if you think about it for even a few seconds. It's like you're stuck with Barbie, you're stuck with Ken, you're stuck with Alan. And again, that name becomes associated with your identity. And again, a lot of people who consider, at least in my circles, I don't know how popular it really is, but at least in my circles, it's pretty popular that people thought of Alan in as a form of non-binary character because he was neither Ken nor Barbie. He was something else. He was just Alan. But again, that is a form of name and identity as a form of thought control. Where it's just, well, you're Alan. You're not Ken, you're not Barbie. So you can't identify with Ken or Barbie. You can't identify with girl or boy because you are Alan. Or you are Alan because you can't identify with either. Again, it's a form of thought control and definitely something worth considering, especially when you're making a story, and especially if you're making a fake group like this, which is like even control over the names is a form of thought control. And again, you see this scaling all the time in real life. You see children given nicknames they don't like. You get teachers that will only address them in a certain way. You get people who are asked to change their names to become more employable or more likely to find a job. So when you consider things like that, it is a form of thought control, and it is pretty wide scale and a lot more prominent than we think. And quite frankly, I could do a whole other video about name and identity and how people control it, but I only want this video to be 2 or 3 hours, not 5 or 7. So once we're done with names, let's talk a little bit more about the identity of people. So if you want an example of an identity being changed or someone being reduced to their identity, you could have people join a cult or group and then forced to change their career. Say, for example, you immigrate to a new country, you were a doctor in your old country. Well, now you're not allowed to be a doctor in the new country. You're a janitor now, because that's the only job they see you fit for. Or you can see someone change their identity in other ways. Oh, you're a family man. Well, we removed you from your family, so now you have to find something else. Again, there are tons of historical examples of this. I'm not going to be digging into that too much. You can also reduce person to just who they are in the role within the cult, addressing them only by their title or job description. You see this all the time, especially in customer service jobs where someone is just called the help. And once you reduce someone to just the role, it's real easy to dehumanize them and treat them as just the role. So you can see it in customer service all the time of changing or even breaking an identity. People are rarely addressed by their name by the customer, and they are usually just that, the role. It's like, oh, you are the person on the phone. You are the person behind the register. You are this person to me. And again, that is just a real life example of changing or reducing someone to an identity. In a cult, you can also see that as something where it's just like, well, this person's the doctor. That's it. They're the doctor. They're the person you go to when you're sick. No, I don't tell you what their name is, or no, they don't share their name, because that's just who they are. They're the doctor. They're the worker. They're the farmer. They're the spy. They're the cook. Do you see? You see how reducing someone to just who they are in their role can break down their identity? Because again, people are complex. We are more than our jobs. We are more than our hobbies. We are even more than who we are in the family. People are complex and deserve to be seen that way. But when you reduce their role and identity, you can help break them a little bit. And again, that's just if you want to go for a realistic fiction. If you want to go something unrealistic, then you can do things like, say, werewolves. Someone's identity literally changes into that of a monster. You can even break their identity, such as Max Brooks' Solanum virus, where it removes the identity from the brain itself. Again, not a good example of a culty thing, because that is viral rather than cult-like, but that's generally the idea. Or even the idea of memetics in the SCP Foundation, where you get exposed to some information or symbol that literally changes who you are on the inside and forces you to behave in a certain way. And again, those are just fictional examples. And as we talked about earlier, symbols can shut down someone's critical thought or focus on the symbols themselves. So those are fictional ideas. I'm sure if you sit and think about it, though, you can really think about how names and identity are linked and how you can really change them for some really sinister effects in the story. Especially if you're dealing with things like Fae, which Fae knowing your name means they have power over you, or them changing your name can change who you are. So again, consider these things when writing, and you have a lot you can do with it. So the next part of thought control is trying to encourage only good and natural thoughts. Easy examples to think about is questioning leadership or thinking positively about leadership at all times. And examples of good and natural thoughts may be explicit, such as don't even think about having sex with someone other than your spouse, don't even fantasize about it. That's the exact same thing as cheating, and cheating is the worst thing you can do. So that is an explicit example of good and natural thoughts being encouraged. And there's more subtle messaging that is encouraged in groups like social media or even among friends, such as, don't you find boys just so attractive? I couldn't imagine being with anyone except a boy. Don't you find this boy hot too? That is an example of a good and natural thought being encouraged. And again, this can be seen in many different ways, and it can get quite severe quite quickly. Some fun examples to think about. Just encouraging people to only think good thoughts no matter what. You may see people post things on their social media like good vibes only, or, oh, I only allow positive people, I only allow positive thoughts near my space. And while there is definitely great strength in positivity, it is also kind of strange to try to imagine that everyone around you is going to be positive all the time. Whether it's just positive towards you or positive in life or positive around everything, no one is happy all the time. And trying to enforce a positive vibes only means that people will either have to pretend to be positive when they are not, so that way you do not exclude them, or you are only going to include people who quite literally can only think positive thoughts, which is done at the exclusion of every other thought. Now that is quite interesting to think about, and again can be seen in many different ways. And again, on society scale, I'm sure there are lots of ways where you can think of society or your government or even just family just encouraging a good and natural thought about something. And on the other scale of the good vibes only is forbidding the bad thoughts, such as critical thought of leadership, criticism of ideals of the cult, or the leadership or policies. To use an example you may be familiar with, if you don't follow us, then the terrorists win. If we don't do this, then the terrorists win. Thoughts like that. And again, forbidding bad thoughts can be viewed in many, many different ways. Again, it's usually a lot more subtle. Things like, well, just don't talk about money around them. Money's a sore subject. Or even things where it's just like, well, we don't talk about that here. We don't talk about them here. We don't talk about that here. We don't think about that here. And sometimes it is stuff where it's just like, even if you think of the devil, then the devil can sneak into your mind. Or something like, say, if you even think about this something bad will happen. Because again, forbidding bad thoughts is another part of the cult, such as real fun examples, forbidding certain thoughts, certain practices, and certain beliefs. So again, you see it a lot in sexuality, quite a bit. Not necessarily because it's easy to control, but it's one of it's one of the things people feel the most taboo about. A lot of people think that their thoughts are weird or too horny or too not horny or too strange in some way to even talk about, let alone think about. So if they even suspect that it's something unnatural or strange, then it's very likely that it will create issues or be something that the cult can use against you. But the cult will try to encourage what they consider good and natural thoughts and forbid bad thoughts. And they can do this explicitly or implicitly. And in both terms, it can be quite sinister, and you may find yourself stuck in a place where you can't even think about those quote unquote bad thoughts anymore. And even if you don't think so, I ask you to just do a little thought exercise. Think about one thing that you normally don't think about. Just one thing. Something that you believe would get you in trouble if anyone knew you were thinking about it. Think about robbing a bank. Think about how you would pull that off. Think about how to pull off the perfect murder. Think about it for a minute. Or think about what cheating would be. Think about how you would pull that off. Think about why you would pull that off. Or think about converting religion. Think about what that would look like. Or you could even think about leaving your country. What would that entail? Where would you go? What would you do? Now, those are all thoughts that may be difficult to think, or it may come quite easily to you. But if all those thoughts came easily to you, I applaud you for having a richer inner life than I am. But I also encourage you to try to think about other things that are less easy to come naturally to you. When you think about these things that don't necessarily come naturally, or the things that don't feel like it's natural, you can allow yourself to critically analyze the world around you in new ways, and you may find yourself able to escape the cult's good and bad thought processes, because now you're realizing that no thought is a bad thought. Just having a thought doesn't automatically make you a bad person, regardless of how depraved or messed up that thought is. Allow yourself to critically analyze your own thoughts and allow yourself to think in thoughts that are both good and bad by whatever societal standards you're thinking of, and understand that your thoughts are not good or bad, they're not black or white. All your thoughts are just that, thoughts. Now, with that understanding, we can move on to the next part of thought control. And related to forbidding bad thoughts and encouraging good thoughts, there is the mind altering techniques. Examples may include hypnosis, drugs, alcohol, sleep deprivation, and hyperfocus on things or hypofocused situations, such as overstimulating you, overworking you, or in cases of understimulation, just keep you in a dark room where you are forced to be alone with your thoughts, or just in a situation where you are not stimulated enough, so you're desperate for any form of stimulation. Those are mind altering techniques. Certain drugs and alcohol can alter your mind, not just the illegal ones or the ones that are heavily regulated, but even something as simple as caffeine or sugar, both can work as mind altering substances. So if you go your entire life without caffeine, and suddenly they start pouring more and more caffeine into your food and drink, you're going to be behaving differently. And then, or if you are dependent or use caffeine every day, they may take it away and then force you into a different mentality than you are now. Quite a few people are closer to insanity than they think. A lot of people are 2 or 3 days and or like 2 or 3 nights of sleep, bad day at work, and no coffee away from going insane. Believe me, I'm speaking from experience there. But any kinds of mind-altering techniques can be used there. They may also use certain music to try to get you to think or feel a certain way, because again, not necessarily, because music's not necessarily hypnotic in a you hear a song once and it makes you believe something. But if you hear a bunch of heroic music to make you feel super strong and super or happy all the time, that may change your thought process, especially if you listen to it a lot. Or if you listen to sad music a lot, it may also bring your mood down as well. Or they may make you stand in something like a stress position or ask you to do physical activity that will force your mind to be more vulnerable to certain actions or ideas. There was a good movie once, I forget its name, but if you know it, you can tell me, where a woman was moved into a apartment complex that was actually a cult. So one of the many things they would do to break her is they would make her stand in a stress position, so that way her body was constantly stressed out. And they could even nail her hands to the stress position, so she was forced to stand that way until she was more receptive to their beliefs and what they wanted her to know. There's also mimetic communication, which in the SCP Foundation is things like a symbol, idea, smell, or a thought that can spread amongst people, changing their minds. Real life mimetic communication is a lot less cool than that, but it is subtle. You can literally try to use small memes or ideas to try to plant a thought or an idea in someone's head. And again, that is something where it's just like one meme one time is not necessarily going to do much. But if you send, say, 10,000 memes to someone, you can solidify them as someone who is or isn't on your side and someone who is or isn't communicative with a certain cult's beliefs. Again, if you want some real life examples of it, try looking at the memes of any fandom or fan culture you're not a fan of. Really look at the memes of the people who are deep inside. You'll look at it and you will likely be extremely confused and not even understand what's happening. That's because the ideas and knowledge that would be necessary for understanding the meme is one that you are not exposed to. And again, that's all. Those are just the real life mind altering techniques. Drugs, alcohol, sleep deprivation can all have a pretty immediate effect on people. Sleep deprivation also can have a long term or short term effects. Hyperfocus and hypofocus situations, where you're either overworking and overstimulating them or understimulating them and removing them from work, can also have some pretty long term effects too. Music, stress positions, and mimetics pretty much is only long term, but they're all real mind altering techniques. Now, in fiction, you can also use things like, say, telepathy, a mind altering meme, like, say, a statue that makes people sacrifice themselves on it, a mind control formula, hypnosis, an eldritch being, possession, things like that. Hypnosis is, quite frankly, way too complicated to explain what is or isn't real, but assume that you can use it in fiction pretty effectively. And what you can use in hypnosis in realistic fiction is going to be a lot less extreme than what you can do in unrealistic fiction. Another form of pretty advanced thought control is memory manipulation. Now, one of the hardest things to deal with psychologically for most individuals is understanding that your memories aren't necessarily accurate, that your memories can be fake, or they can be manipulated in some way. It is a difficult thing to reconcile with because memories make up a good chunk of who we are. In a lot of people's mentality, we are our memories, we are our experiences. So if some or even all of your experiences and memories are fake, then doesn't that make you a fake person? I am not here to argue the philosophy one way or the other, but it is definitely something that is kind of dark and could be explored in fiction quite interestingly. But yes, memories can be manipulated. Gaslighting, which we discussed briefly earlier, where you can convince someone that something that they see or they're doing or they're hearing isn't actually there, or you can convince them that they are actually insane. You can create false evidence of certain actions happening, So that way it can contradict their memories and then keep presenting them false evidence until their memories line up with the false evidence. Using an example from a short film I saw once, a daughter actually replaced the picture of her mother in her father's wallet to try to convince him that he was going insane, because when he actually looked at the photo, it was not who he remembered. And then she did lots of little things like that to convince him he was going crazy, such as replacing photos in the shack, moving things around, changing the date on the calendar, convincing him it was actually his birthday when it wasn't, even killing his dog and telling him that the dog has been dead for over a year, just to try to drive him insane. That is an example of gaslighting, and that is an example of how it can change memories. Because when you're presented with evidence that your memories are fake, there's a cognitive dissonance, again, a disconnect in logic, where it's a, do you trust your memories or you trust the evidence in front of you? And again, even if this, and again, it's tough to reconcile, because then it's either the people around you are manipulating you, or your memories, or even your mind itself are things that are not working. People can't reconcile those things easily. I can't reconcile that thing easily. So again, it may just be easier for you to convince yourself that the false memories are real, or the false evidence is real evidence. So that way false memories can be planted. It can also be planted in drug-induced states. But again, that's a little more complicated, and I'm simplifying a real science down extremely small. But yes, you can actually put people in a drug-induced state, make them live through a traumatic event that they've had, and then actually rewrite the traumatic event so either it occurs differently or the traumatic event was created by a different thing. And again, that is a way of manipulating the memory. You can also use deep fakes in this modern day and age to try to act or create more false evidence, even going so far as to make videos or pictures that didn't actually exist, try to convince someone that something that didn't exist did happen, something that didn't happen did happen. So again, it is a form of memory manipulation and a pretty extreme form of gaslighting. It can also convince the group that you're in that you're a liar, isolating you from sources that can verify or validate truth or your own memories. So that is also a form of manipulation. If you have any kind of mental illness or events that can affect your memory, that could be that too. They could even go so far as to induce brain trauma, chemically or physically, so that way that your memories can either be harder to access or they can be manipulated in some way. And again, these are just the real techniques that can actually do this. If we're talking fiction, then we can start using things like aliens, we can use brain surgery to change memories, we can induce memories with a strange chemical formula, you can use altered statues, you can use ghosts, all kinds of things. And again, those are just based on the fake things. There's even more things in fiction you can think of to manipulate memory. And if you can manipulate the memory, it's a lot easier to manipulate thought, because then the memories they're basing it off of is something that they already have, which can then shape a thought of what you're doing now. So think about that if you want to do something fun with it. The next part of thought control is thought stopping. Denial, rationalization, justification, and wishful thinking are all examples of thought stopping. To use an example, convincing someone or telling them that what they went through wasn't as bad as they think it was, or it didn't even happen at all. It can even be something as denying something that did happen. Oh, I didn't actually hurt you, you just fell down the stairs. Sometimes it can be them convincing you to do that. Versus like, okay, just tell yourself that you fell down the stairs, you weren't actually hit. And sometimes it's a rationalization, which again rationalizes the things that happened. Oh, I was hit because I was bad, and that's okay. Because I did something bad, I got punished, and that's rationalizing it. Then there's justification, which is again related to rationalization, but it just justifies everything that's happening. I'm a bad person. I deserve to be hit. Then there's the wishful thinking, which is things like, if I'm good someday, then the hitting will stop. To use a more fictitious example, denial can be things like, that isn't a ghost haunting me. Rationalization is, I am not hallucinating. Justification would be, I'm seeing the ghost because I am hallucinating. Wishful thinking is, if I just ignore these things long enough and I don't get tested, they'll just go away on their own. Again, you can do a lot with the thought stopping there, but it's essentially anything to stop someone's thought process or train of thought. Again, these can get physical, but they're usually a lot more effective when they're purely psychological. Because again, if you hit someone every time they say the word pineapple, you might get them to stop saying the word pineapple, but you're not likely to make them stop thinking the word either. But what do I know there? So, connected to that strangeness, there are also physical actions to try and stop thoughts. They can try to have you chant, meditate, pray, sing, hum, vocally stim, or just repeat the slogans. You'll hear repeated slogans a lot to try to get people to stop thinking about certain things or to make them act a certain way. Songs and singing can also be an effective form of this. Again, it's interesting because singing can also be a form of resistance, it can be a form of critical thought, and it can also be a form of freedom. Or it can also be used as a way of trying to stop the thought. Again, it comes down to what's going on. A small scale example you can think of is someone telling their child to just sing a song every time they're sad. So now every time they think they're sad or they think about singing sad, they sing instead until the sadness goes away. Again, it's a relatively small scale example, but it can work on the big scale too. And then related to the physical action, there's also repetitive actions to force thoughts to stop, such as hitting your own head, inflicting injury on yourself or others, cooking and cleaning, baking, anything like that. Essentially, anything that can be a coping mechanism for anxiety can also be used as a form of thought stop, which is interesting because anxiety, at least in some forms, is a form of repeatedly thinking something that's making you uncomfortable. So, a physical action that can stop anxiety can also be used to stop critical thought. So again, it's something worth considering, where it's just like, are you cleaning the house because it needs to be clean? Are you cleaning it because you're worried about tomorrow and you just need to stop thinking about it for a little bit? Or are you cleaning the house because you don't want to think about tomorrow under any circumstances? Again, it's something worth considering because physical actions can stop your thoughts. So if you're doing something highly repetitive to avoid anxiety, that's worth considering. But it should also be considered like, are you actually trying to stop anxiety or are you trying to stop an absolute thought? Because again, if you're just anxious about tomorrow and want to get less anxious, cleaning your house seems good. But if you don't want to think about tomorrow at all, so you're constantly cleaning to avoid thinking about it, that's something you should definitely critically analyze. And again, you see this coping mechanism with people a lot too, where they're constantly doing actions to avoid thinking certain thoughts. And again, it is a form of coping mechanism, but it is also a form of thought stop and thought control. So, relating to the repetitive actions, we have something a little less esoteric. You also have the rejection of rational thought, logic, critical thinking, constructive criticism of yourself or others, usually others, and either create a new system of thought or makes you think that logic won't work here at all. I know it seems weird to think about, but the rejection of rational thought is usually one of the biggest red flags that you are in a cult-like environment. So if you're thinking things like, why are we breaking all these rocks? We don't use these rocks for anything. That is a form of rational thought. If you are thinking things like, wait, I don't understand where all my blood is going when I donate blood every week, that's also a form of rational thought. And indeed, you may even think critically about a situation like, oh, we're supposed to be feeding the monster in the sea, but I've never actually seen the sea monster. So how do we know we're sacrificing things to a sea monster? And then there's also constructive criticism. Things like, look, I know we have to keep Dagon contained in the oceans, but why don't we try letting the military know so that way they can help contain it? That is a form of constructive criticism. And in fiction, the rejection of rational thought can oftentimes be things like, you don't try to understand the ghost isn't meant to be understood, or the witch is a witch, she can't be spoken to. It is meant to make you feel isolated and can make it hard to explain what is happening, especially when you're asked to reject your rational thought and also your logic and critical thinking. Because then it becomes hard to convey things without your critical thought. Where it's the, I saw this person do this, but maybe I didn't, and maybe it's something else, and maybe, and all that. Because again, rational thought, logic, and critical thinking can oftentimes get you out of conspiratorial thought processes. Because again, rational thought and logic goes a long way. And again, people will use small things to make you question your rational thoughts and doubt critical thought in the beginning. So to use an example, a boyfriend refusing to turn off lights or faucets because they choose not to use their hands for it, which they consider as the same thing as choosing to not use your hands for being a mechanic. Or, someone being told that the place they want to go for lunch or dinner isn't open when it's supposed to be open, and telling that person that both online and calling the restaurant itself isn't accurate. Again, it's a rejection of rational thought and a rejection of outside sources and critical thought. So by making you reject these things, it makes it easier for the cult to control you. Because if you aren't thinking rationally about something, or you can't trust your own rational thought, you're more likely to trust someone telling you how to think. Again, it's a form of thought control and is definitely a form of gaslighting. We've talked about gaslighting before, so I'm not going to cover it here, but you can definitely use that in fiction quite effectively, from someone manipulating an entire fake scenario to control someone, to something a little more eldritch, where a family is being haunted by, say, an eldritch angel, and everyone in the family is pretending it's not there. They're just trying to convince themselves and everyone else that the angel isn't actually there, only need for that to break in some way. So again, that's an interesting thing to think about. And then once they get you to reject your rational thought and critical thought, that leads to the next form of thought control, one of the most sinister yet. One of the final aspects of thought control is the establishment of a new map or cosmology of reality. Once they get you to reject your rational thought and critical thinking, once you start thinking everything is black and white, once you understand the outsider and insider and you want to be an insider, they will now want your reality to conform to their ideals. Everything either supports their cosmology or ideal, or it's a lie. So, for example, governments suddenly become the SCP Foundation, making all this tons of evidence that the Earth is round when it's supposedly flat, and everything is designed to support that because I don't know why. And again, they're the SCP Foundation doing that, but at the same time, they're somehow not able to do something as simple as catch someone on sharing a book, or catch someone posting it online, or catch someone who made the Antarctica flag. Because again, reality has to conform to their ideals. Government is powerful enough to somehow fake flights, fake space travel, fake the sun and moon itself, and even fake the way the Earth curves when you fly up or when you study it using certain tests. But somehow it's also incompetent and weak when there's stuff like the Antarctic flag or someone publishing a book. Because it's just easier to fake airplanes than it is to fake a, a, a book. But yeah, that is where an example of where the New World Order has to comply with their ideals. Everything either becomes support for it or it becomes a lie. Once you're rejecting critical thought and you can only trust the insider information, then everything becomes evidence of that. Stars become angels shining down because you can see the angels in a deep trance. But telescopes, science, and millennia of study become a conspiracy to keep angels a secret. Things like that. And again, in fiction, you're going to see things like that a lot, where they want you to comply with their new world order, their new map, or their cosmology, or their whatever you want to call it. You are now in with them, so now you see reality the way they want you to see it. And everything you do either supports or contradicts this belief. And again, with that now done, their thought control is essentially complete. You don't have critical thought anymore. You can only think black and white. The cult is always right. Everyone outside is an outsider and dangerous. Now it's even easier for you to do whatever they want them to do. They want you building those temples in the forest, you'll be building those temples in the forest. They want you giving up 95% of your income, you'll give up 95% of your income. They want you for sexual purposes, they will have you for sexual purposes. And again, all of that because they managed to dig very deep into thought control. And again, there's still one more letter of the byte model. So with the thought control settled, they can now focus on emotional control. Again, emotional control has significant overlap with thought control and informational control, and even a little bit with behavioral control, but we're still going to be discussing it as well. So with emotional control, because even if you think a certain way, it doesn't necessarily mean you feel a certain way. You don't feel the correct way they want you to feel. So with that in mind, they will also need to manipulate that, which is done with some similar practices, some different from the ones before. So we're going to be discussing them just a little bit. So relating to the good thoughts being encouraged and bad thoughts being discouraged, there's the narrowing of emotions. Some emotions are good, some are bad. Usually you're required to feel all happy all the time or angry at the right subjects or people. Your emotions are constantly required to be the correct emotion in the correct situation. And if you don't feel that way, they will encourage you to act like you do, either to avoid exclusion from the group or to avoid an active punishment. And again, this can take many different forms and many different scales. Sometimes it can be something as simple as you're at a funeral and you don't feel sad when everyone around you is sad, so people expect you to act sad, so you act sad. Or it could be something more complex or sinister, such as you are posting something online about something that occurred near you, and the people are wondering why you didn't respond to it correctly. They're wondering why you aren't angry enough. They're wondering why you aren't happy enough. They're wondering why you're not sad enough. Again, emotions get narrowed and they're not allowed to be complex. You can't feel angry at something and sad at the same time. You can't feel relieved that your abuser is dead and also sad that you lost someone you loved. You can't feel happy that you have a new job and also sad that a new cycle of your life is angry. Everything has to be a narrow emotion, some good, some bad. And again, some will encourage constant anger, some will encourage constant happiness, some will encourage constant sadness. And again, those emotions you are required to feel will be encouraged at all times. Again, usually they'll focus on the positive emotions, but there are definitely small-scale cults that will definitely focus on anger and also sadness. There's definitely cult-like organizations you can probably think of that are constantly angry or hateful and seem to encourage more anger and hate from all of its members. So complex emotions such as doubt, homesickness, loneliness, or similar emotions are taught to just be ignored. So as you are ignoring the bad emotions and focusing on the good ones, it gets easier and easier for them to just have you always in the correct emotion. They may even target your emotional competency if you're young enough or just don't know it very well, where they won't give you certain words or certain emotions, just that it's bad to feel a certain way. It's bad to feel hurt. It's bad to feel hungry. It's bad to feel whatever. So that way you only feel the good emotions that they want you to feel. Another part of emotional control is that problems become the fault of the individual, never something institutional or systematic or even external. The person is the cause of all their problems. The cult is the source of all their solutions. Again, this may seem counterintuitive because if you're doing an outsider-insider mentality, it may seem counterintuitive to say, well, your problems are your own, until you realize it starts becoming things where it's just like, well, clearly you're feeling bad about the way we treated the outsiders because it's something wrong with you. Let us fix how you're feeling so that way you don't feel bad when we hurt the outsiders. Suddenly, the cult or the institution is no longer at fault for hurting the outsiders. It is the individual's fault for feeling bad that the outsiders are hurt. So why so by defining your problems as just that, always an individual's problems that always need to be fixed, the cult that always has an answer, it becomes easier and easier for them to control you emotionally because every problem is a personal one and every solution is always an institutional one. You can't just be upset because the cult did something wrong. You can't just be angry because the government did something wrong. It's something you did, and it's something you could do better. It's something the cult will help you do better in next time. And relating to that, we now have guilt. The cult will try to promote guilt as a handle or means of control over the individual, either directly or indirectly. So, for example, let's say the cult tells you that you are living in sin because all are born in sin, or that you are not living up to your potential, that you're smart in other things, but so you need to be smart in this thing too, or that your past, family, culture, gender, or race is inherently distrustful, or that you, as a person, or humanity in general, is inherently selfish, guilty, or bad in some way. There is some innate quality that you have that that makes you inherently a bad person. Something that the cult or the identity that they're trying to promote is the only way to help you get better. So when you consider that, then it makes sense for them to promote guilt. You did wrong because you are wrong in some way. We did right because we are inherently right in some way. It is related to the insider-outsider mentality. And if they can keep you feeling guilty in some way, it's generally a lot easier to manipulate your emotions, especially if you're feeling guilty about something you're doing for the cult or something the cult has done, because then that is something the cult can use to make you feel bad. They make you feel like the only way to get rid of the guilt or the only way to redeem yourself is through the cult or actions supporting the cult. But you notice that the way to completely get rid of the guilt or completely redeem yourself is something that can never be achieved while you're alive. You'll do something and then it's like, okay, you did good. Now there's more you need to do. Okay, you did that, so clearly you've proven yourself not to be sinful. But there's more you need to do. There's always more you need to do to get rid of the guilt. Even up to and after sacrificing your life, there will always be more that they need you to do to remove your guilt or badness in some way. And again, by promoting this guilt, it is a way that they can control you, because now it's a lot harder for you to escape if it feels like everything you do is inherently guilty, bad, or selfish in some way. Another form of emotional control that the cult will use is extreme emotions or inducing extreme emotions. Samples include love bombing, guilt tripping, inducing loneliness and community, sometimes one right after the other to force you into a confused state. Extreme terror to sudden relief. You may be degraded by your leader one moment and then praised the next. You may be called a maggot 1 second and then called a warrior the next. Anything to keep you both off balanced and constantly desiring the high emotions and avoiding the lows. Again, it relates to some of the models we talked about earlier, But this one is specific because these extreme emotions can help shape what people do. If people are aware of their highs and they are aware of their lows, and they are aware of how they can get both, then it's easier to control. Usually with newer members, you will force them into those extreme states of like, well, this person's loyal enough, so let's show them what happens when they leave. Oh, look at that. Now they're extremely sad. Let's praise them and show them where the good is. Now they're going to want the good and they're going to hate the bad. It is a fairly straightforward form of manipulation, but it is incredibly effective. You'll find it used a lot, especially in places where people are expected to be degraded as part of the career. And when you have people who are in careers where they are expected to be degraded, it is a lot easier to manipulate them, especially when they expect it to be coming. Because then they assume that it's normal to be emotionally manipulated. They assume that it's normal to be treated like shit. They assume that it's normal to be treated badly and to get some kind of reward at the end. The trouble with doing things like that is it can also lead to escalating situations or for people just justifying anything they do. After all, if a fraternity has always tortured their pledges, then clearly they're just going to keep torturing them, right? Even if some of them die or get injured, that's fine because they went through the same thing too, right? And now they get the emotional high of getting to inflict that pain on someone else, just because they were hurt as well. You'll find a lot of similarities to the bullying cycle there. Another aspect of emotional control is rituals. Rituals, public confessions, anything that can cement you into the cult and into their control. Now, when you think rituals, you generally think fiction, or you think religious rituals. And those are definitely true, but there are also little rituals that can be used to indoctrinate people into a cult that are not religious. An example may be in the United States, such as the Pledge of Allegiance. That is an example of a ritual designed for emotional control. You may be doing something like, say, a sports class, I don't know the actual term, or an exercise class where you start the class where everyone starts chanting the name of the sport or the exercise, and they just chant it over and over and over again until everyone is in an emotionally high or super jazzed space. And once that is done, then they can begin their actions. You may even have people do things where they just all hold a hand in a circle and just say something like, I am bad, and that is good. I will never be good, and that's not bad. That is an example of a ritual used for emotional control. Again, these are not all negative, and these are not all bad contexts. But again, a lot of rituals can be extremely manipulative and can be used to make people emotionally reliant on the cult. You can see these rituals used to tie people to the cult. You can even see it to cement certain emotions. And in fiction, this can be anything from a random ritual in a rules pasta. You can have it be the SCP Foundation's containment procedures, because in the end, what are those but rituals? And you can also have people who agree to help you only if you confess to them first. Which again is an interesting thing to do, because why would you require a confession before someone would assist you? Think about that for a second. But the rituals can also induce emotional feelings. Another fun example of public rituals is public music. Lots of religious organizations and even secular organizations will arrange concerts where people will play music or they show art, and it has to be approved by the organization or cult in some way. And that is a way of emotionally getting everyone on the same board, such as such as inducing a certain emotion with the music, or just the feeling that you can only get this thing because you're a part of the inner circle of this group. Again, it's an interesting form of emotional manipulation and quite effective regardless of age. But you'll notice it is used most often with children. After all, isn't it odd how often children are asked to sit in a circle? Isn't it odd how often children are asked to play games together? And again, games can be a social thing, or they could be a ritual for cementing rules. Because again, you're using rules to induce an emotional response and rewarding those who follow the rules, and then punishing those who do not follow the rules, often in a public way. Again, comes down to scaling. A lot of the games are harmless, they're just games. Some games, on the other hand, are meant to reinforce something much larger. So consider that when making a game or when participating in a game. And again, it's worth considering and it's worth remembering. And now to the fun part of emotional control of cults. You say fun part, these are all interesting. But this is probably the one that a lot of people who are doing fictional cults is the one looking for either. The cult has to induce a greater fear of leaving than of staying. You may be threatened directly by the cult, such as them threatening you with death, harm, loss of status for yourself or those around you. Or they may instead make you fear the outside world, such as making you afraid you'll be damned to hell for leaving. You might be given an incurable disease, or you might be cursed with something that cannot be removed. Or again, this change may fall upon those around you, or maybe even on the members of the cult itself that you care about. But again, the point of the phobia indoctrination is to make you more afraid of leaving than you are of staying. Again, this can be done in many different ways, such as asking you to commit crimes so that way you fear the justice system outside the cult. It may be because you think something esoteric or eschatological will occur if you leave, such as the end of the world, a meteorite, falling star, or whatever will strike the world if you leave. And again, the phobia indoctrination relies on fear to keep you inside the cult. Because again, regardless of how good things are inside the cult, fear can cause people to stay. Because if the cult only offered good things, then people would naturally come and go all the time. Think of it like a club after school that offers pizza all the time. Now imagine if you go to a club after school that offers pizza all the time, and they tell you if you leave the organization, they will kill you. Well, now all of a sudden you're kind of stuck staying, aren't you? So with that in mind, though, the phobia indoctrination also leads to the next part. With the sense that there is something dangerous if you leave the cult, there is also the realization that others have left the cult. So if you get news of someone leaving the cult, it has to be that everyone who leaves or survives the cult never has a legitimate reason for doing so. They were either seduced out of the organization, they were weak and that's why they left, they were wrong in some way, or they were evil, or they were actually the ones who were brainwashed to leave the cult from another cult, or just outside the cult. But again, it's that feeling of there is no way out. There is no legitimate way out of the cult. If you leave or if you survive, something bad will happen to you. Everyone who has already left has done so because they were bad in some way, or something bad will happen to them. So it will be sure to encourage you to stay, because again, it is a fear of you need to be socially accepted, and that if you leave, something bad will happen to you, and everyone who's come before who has left never had a legitimate reason for doing so, and is in some way likely dangerous or in danger themselves. Again, it's something worth considering because there is a lot of different ways you can explore this. And I know the emotional part has been a lot shorter, but I tried to cover the new stuff in the emotional that wasn't covered in the earlier things. But a lot of forms of behavioral, information, and even thought control can also be easily applied to the emotional control. If you're controlling the person's technology, you can likely control their emotions by what they're exposed to on the technology. If you're controlling the information that's flowing into the cult, you can also control the kinds of books they read and what kinds of emotions those books are intended to induce. So again, with the bite model now understood, now let's do the fun part. We're going to build a fictional cult. If you actually want to build a real cult, I'm sure there's someone selling a book for that somewhere in some multi-marketing leveling scheme, Ponzi, whatever. And I'm going to have to ask you to not actually build a cult. These are purely fictional and meant to be used for fictional purposes. And I hope everyone understands that. Okay, ready? So, with the cult, one of the first things you're going to need is you're going to need a charismatic leader of some kind, usually someone intelligent, or at least intelligent enough. Charisma can mean many different things to many different people, but generally speaking, you need someone who can be persuasive and someone who can be good with their voice. You're going to need someone who can think on their feet, and you need someone who can plan. Because again, someone who can only think in the short term, generally their cult's not going to last too long. Someone who only thinks in the long term is going to run into issues that they can't predict. And now the cult doesn't necessarily just have to have one leader, it can have multiple leaders. Again, these multiple leaders can take anything from, say, a council to a group of friends to teens with attitude. I don't know. But if your cult is going to have multiple leaders, you're going to have those leaders focus on different specialties. And they're also going to either have a single leader who they all confer to as the ultimate authority, or they need a system in place where they can deal with disputes in a productive and non-confrontational way. Because quite simply, if you have a cult where everything just kind of is led by, let's say 13 people, it's led by a council of 13, each person gets an equal vote, each person has equal amount of power, eventually they're going to run into conflicts, and eventually they're going to run into a stalemate or something that can't be resolved peacefully. So if there is an ultimate authority they all answer to, then that ultimate authority can weigh on it and quite possibly do so peacefully. Or if they have a system in place, like say tiebreaker votes or even something as simple as, okay, let's do both, that's more likely to last long. But there's a reason most cults have one charismatic leader and not multiple. So, if you want to do an effective cult, you're going to want one supreme or head leader, and then a council of either specialists or experts who advise and support them. So, with that in mind, let's figure out the next part of the cult, which is their ideals. So all organizations of all scales need ideals of some kind. Whether you're a social club that meets after school, or you're a multinational organization with tens of thousands of members, you need ideals of some kind. You need something to either lead the cult with, or you need something to attract people with. So let's say, for example, you want to attract people into a cult that says every house needs to be repaired. Okay, so your ideals are going to be based on home repair and based on the ideals that everyone needs home repair. So with those ideals around, you can build your membership and you can build your cult's activities out from that. So if every house is repaired, odds are you're going to recruit a lot of house repairmen. Odds are you're going to be fixing a lot of houses. Or you're going to be intimidating people into repairing their own houses. Either way, but those ideals is what will help shape your actions and what you as the cult want. But note that a cult's ideals is not necessarily the same thing as their goals. Because again, ideals is what they can stand for. Their goals are what they want. Okay, so now you have a cult with ideals. What are your goals? So you have a supreme leader with a council whose ultimate ideals of their cult is every house should be repaired. So your goal is what? That every house in the world should be repaired? Or is your goal going to be something like every house built will no longer need repairs? And again, how will you achieve these goals? So if your end goal is that no more houses are going to need repairs, is this a goal you're going to achieve by fixing every house on the planet? Which is again, pretty steep goal. That's going to take a lot of work. And if your goal is by fixing every house on the planet, you're going to need things like logistics. You're going to need things like money. You're going to have to ask the questions like, are you going to charge the people for fixing their houses or are you not? How are you going to tell them that you're going to fix their houses? Are you even going to tell them? Or are you just going to break into everyone's houses and repair their homes while they're asleep or when they're not home? Again, there's a lot of interesting things you can do with that there. Real interesting how quickly it went from, well, every home should be repaired into, and now there are people breaking into my house to fix my house. And that's if you want to make sure that every house no longer needs to be repaired is done by fixing every house. What if on the other end, you're like, well, actually, it's just easier that every house in the world is burned down, so no one needs any more repairs? Well, then you have a much more disastrous cult, and one that's a lot more interesting in most fictional circles. After all, now you have destruction. Now you have people running around. Now you have people sneaking around. Now you have destruction of all kinds. And again, that is just a cult that has a goal that no more houses should be repaired. And that is just based on their goals. And now with their goals done, now you have other interesting questions. Now, other interesting questions. How would you recruit for a cult like this? Do you just recruit someone off the street, anyone, and then you train them to repair other houses or destroy other houses, depending on which ideal you chose? Or do you specifically only target people who have the skills to repair houses and try to get them into your cult? Again, either way, it's going to take a lot of work, and it would be quite interesting to see in both regards, where we have to train a bunch of people who's never or screwed in a light bulb how to fix a whole house, or we have to train an entire army of people who spent their entire lives building houses to destroy them. Again, that's just based on recruitment. Then you also have the how do you do information control? How do you control your cult's behavior? How do you control their thoughts? How do you control their emotions? Again, those are just all based on goals. And because it's fiction, you can also have things where it's just like, is the cult actually having some interesting information or supernatural influence? Because again, are these cult of home wreckers and home repairmen, are they obeying some ideal from a higher being, or is it just the ideal they have? Is some eldritch god telling them to break every house on the planet because that's how the eldritch god will rise? We don't know. And again, we can do a lot of things. And the interesting part about fiction is even if the cult is correct, then there is something supernatural. That does not necessarily remove what they're doing as bad. It doesn't do what they're doing as toxic or dangerous in some way. It can still be toxic. It can still be dangerous even with the supernatural out there. So, with that knowledge in mind, it gets real interesting real quick about what you can do. And again, this is just based on the idea of a cult of people whose ideals is no houses should be broken. So, with that in mind, what kind of cults can you build? You can build almost anything in fiction. You can make it something super realistic. A group of rich people who believe that the end of the world is coming, and if they get everyone into this special compound, they can save everyone there. Or you can make it something a little less realistic. You have a cult of cooks out there who are trying to brainwash people with their special sauces, and those sauces are making people worship a giant spaghetti god. Yes, that is based on an actual fiction I read. I leave it to you if it was good or not. Or you can also do something even more esoteric and interesting. You could have an alien invasion and have the first wave of the alien invasion actually be the cult. A group of believers who are using the technology as a form of behavior, information, thought, and emotion control. And they use it to spread and recruit and grow stronger and prepare the planet for an alien invasion. Because again, you have recruitment there, you have their goals, you have their ideals, and you can use any part of the bite model to help encourage that little invasion from outer space. Or you can even go in the exact opposite direction and try to have a cult with positive ideals who's trying to make a positive impact on the planet. And they still have to use the bite model, just in a different way, or in a way that they construe as positive, or maybe even you, as the author, can construe as positive. Let's use the alien invasion as an example. You now have a cult of believers who are now telling the world that alien invasion is imminent, and the only way to protect themselves is by following their way. Then they could try to teach people how to resist the aliens. They could teach them their technology. They could teach them everything that there is going to happen and how to fight or prepare against it. And again, you would have to manipulate people in some way to believe you. Because again, if you just flat out said, this is an alien and defense book, I'm not sure how many copies you would sell. Actually, you might sell a few. Yeah, that'd be a fun thing. Just do an alien defense handbook and throw it out there like the zombie survival guide. See if that gets any hook, lines, and sinkers. But even if you do that, that might not be enough for the cult, but it would still be a part of the bite model because it's a form of information and behavioral control. And then they could train people. They could have those people train other people, either by recruitment, either by hiring them, or even just by offering free seminars or all kinds of things. Because again, you could try to do a cult with a positive message, with a positive end goal, and still have it be a cult. And if that is an angle you want to explore, by all means, explore that. I think that would be something fantastic. And again, these thoughts and these methods, even though they're based on real things, is generally to get you started and to get you thinking about these things. Because again, this video is slightly over 3 hours long. Yeah, and this is just talking about all the stuff that can make up a cult. You, on the other hand, can definitely make a cult. So think to yourself, with whatever you want to do with the cult in fiction, you want it to be good or bad, if you want it to be positive or negative, if how you want it to control people, how you want it to spread, what you want its end goal to be, and whether or not you want it to be right or wrong. Because again, these cults could be wrong. The alien defense cult could be completely wrong, and there is no invasion coming. Then at that point, no matter how positive the message, then it's just not happening. It's just never going to come. Or you could have something that's extremely negative, extremely apocalyptic, and just never come. Because again, fiction is fun like that, and there's tons of different things you can explore, and I, as a writer, can only get you started. You, as your own writer, also need to get yourself there. Get your ideas down. Write them down. Feel free to share any questions or comments or ideas you have with me, and I'll be more than happy to discuss it in the comments. Just know that your writing is your own writing and your work is your own work. You can do anything you want here, and this is just to get you started.